The Orpheus Sector's transformation from a collection of unremarkable star systems into one of the Imperium's most strategically vital regions began with whispers in the dark. Long before the first Imperial colonists set foot on its worlds, the sector bore the scars of civilizations that had risen and fallen in epochs lost to human memory. Archaeological surveys conducted during the Great Crusade had identified traces of advanced xenotech scattered across dozens of worlds, but the pressing demands of expansion left these discoveries cataloged and forgotten in Administratum Archives. The first comprehensive xenoarchaeological expedition arrived in the early 35th millennium, led by Mago's explorator Threnex Gamma of the Adeptus Mechanicus. His flotilla of survey vessels spent 3 decades methodically examining the stellar debris and planetary surfaces that showed signs of ancient habitation. What they uncovered defied easy categorization. Crystalline structures buried beneath kilometers of sediment on Amarah Prime displayed technological principles that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Metallic compounds found in the asteroid fields around Orpheus VII exhibited properties that Imperial metallurgists could not replicate, despite centuries of analysis. The most disturbing discoveries emerged from deep core samples taken from worlds across the sector's primary trade routes. Layers of vitrified sand and metal, dating back millions of years, suggested weapons of unimaginable power had once scoured these worlds clean of life. Radiation signatures embedded in the geological record spoke of energies that exceeded anything in the Imperium's arsenal. Yet beneath these apocalyptic traces lay something more unsettling, evidence of deliberate reconstruction. The same worlds that had been subjected to total annihilation showed signs of careful terraforming and infrastructure development in subsequent geological periods. Threnex Gamma's reports to Mars described technological artifacts that incorporated principles fundamentally alien to human understanding. Devices that generated localized gravitational fields without visible power sources. Crystalline matrices that stored vast amounts of data in quantum states that collapsed when observed directly. Most troubling were the architectural remains that seemed to phase in and out of real space, visible only when approached from specific angles or during certain stellar alignments. The Adeptus Mechanicus classified these findings under the highest levels of secrecy, but word inevitably reached the Administratum's Colonial Planning Division. The sector's strategic position along emerging trade routes, combined with preliminary surveys indicating vast mineral wealth, made it an attractive target for Imperial expansion despite the xenoarchaeological concerns. The decision to proceed with colonization came down to simple mathematics. The Imperium's growing industrial needs outweighed the risks posed by ancient alien ruins. The first wave of colonization began in earnest during the late 35th millennium. Massive generation ships carrying millions of settlers departed from overcrowded hive worlds in the Segmentum Solar, their holds packed with prefabricated hab blocks, industrial equipment, and the genetic material needed to establish sustainable populations. The Adeptus Mechanicus secured authorization to establish 3 major forge worlds within the sector. Mordian Gamma, positioned to exploit the rare earth deposits of the Orpheus Belt. Metallica Secundus, built around the massive shipyards needed to support the sector's growing fleet requirements. And Lucius Minor, dedicated to the research and reverse engineering of recovered xenotech. The Imperial Navy established void stations at key gravitational confluence points, creating a network of refueling and repair facilities that would prove crucial in the conflicts to come. Battlefleet Orpheus began as a modest patrol force built around a handful of cruiser squadrons and supporting escorts, but the sector's rapid growth in strategic importance led to steady reinforcement. By the 36th millennium, the fleet included 2 battle barges on permanent station and a rotating deployment of capital ships from neighboring sectors. Agricultural worlds sprouted across systems with suitable atmospheric conditions and stellar radiation levels. Orpheus Prime became the sector's primary food production center, its vast continents converted into endless fields of corpse starch wheat and protein farms. The planet's 3 moons were hollowed out, and converted into massive food processing and storage facilities. They're artificial gravity generators working around the clock to maintain optimal growing conditions for the sector's expanding population. Hive worlds followed as industrial demands grew beyond the capacity of the Forge worlds alone. Kronos became a manufacturing center, specializing in munitions and basic military equipment. Its population swelled to over 40 billion within 2 centuries, packed into towering arcologies that stretched from the planet's surface to the edge of its atmosphere. The world's natural resources were consumed with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind a landscape of strip mines and chemical processing plants that turned the sky a perpetual orange-brown. The establishment of these major population centers created a web of dependencies that bound the sector together economically and militarily. Trade routes between worlds carried not just goods and materials, but also the constant flow of personnel, information, and cultural exchange that gave the Orpheus Sector its distinct character. Merchant houses grew wealthy, facilitating this commerce, their private fleets becoming an unofficial auxiliary to the Imperial Navy's patrol forces. Yet even as human civilization took root across dozens of worlds, subtle signs emerged that the sector's ancient past was not as dormant as the colonists believed. Seismic monitoring stations on agricultural worlds began recording unusual patterns of underground activity. The tremors followed no recognizable geological pattern, occurring in sequences that suggested artificial origin rather than natural tectonic movement. Deep mining operations on several worlds reported equipment failures that defied explanation, power tools that suddenly lost all energy despite full charge indicators, excavation machinery that simply stopped functioning when they reached certain depths, and communication equipment that produced static patterns resembling mathematical sequences. On Amarah Prime, the largest of the agri-worlds, farmers began reporting crop failures in geometric patterns that spread across thousands of hectares. The affected areas showed no signs of disease or pest infestation, but the plants simply withered and died in perfect circles and straight lines that were visible from orbital surveys. Soil analysis revealed trace amounts of exotic particles that matched no known elements in Imperial databases. When Adeptus Mechanicus teams attempted to investigate these anomalies, their equipment registered energy readings that spiked and faded without apparent cause. The Forge world of Metallica Secundus experienced its own share of unexplained phenomena. Manufacturing equipment would occasionally produce components with tolerances far exceeding their programmed specifications, as if guided by some external intelligence. Quality control servitors reported finding finished products that incorporated design elements not present in their original schematics. Most disturbing were the reports from tech adepts working in the deepest levels of the Forge complexes, who claimed to hear mechanical sounds emanating from below the facility's foundations, rhythmic pulses and harmonic frequencies that seemed to respond to the Forge world's own industrial activity. The rogue trader dynasties operating in the sector's outer reaches played a crucial role in both expanding Imperial influence and inadvertently awakening threats that had slumbered for millions of years. House Kryn established profitable mining operations in the asteroid fields of the Orpheus Belt, their massive extraction platforms pulling rare minerals from ancient debris fields. The dynasty's warrant of trade granted them broad authority to exploit resources and establish commercial relationships, but their pursuit of profit led them to ignore safety protocols that might have prevented disaster. Kryn's deep space mining barges used gravitational manipulation technology to break apart asteroids and extract valuable ores. The process required generating intense gravitic fields that could pulverize rock and separate materials by density. What the rogue traders did not realize was that many of the asteroids they targeted were not natural formations, but the remnants of ancient structures, their original purpose lost to time. The gravitational disruption caused by the mining operations sent resonance waves through quantum substrata that connected to dormant systems across multiple worlds. House Quintanus focused their efforts on the sector's outer rim, establishing trading posts and fuel depots that extended Imperial influence into previously unexplored regions. Their exploration fleets discovered dozens of dead worlds bearing the scars of ancient conflicts, but the rogue traders saw only opportunities for salvage and resource extraction. Automated mining drones stripped useful materials from ruined cities, while archaeological teams collected artifacts for sale to private collectors and Adeptus Mechanicus research facilities. The most significant discovery came when Quintanus surveyors, investigating a seemingly barren world designated Orpheus 47, detected massive metallic structures buried beneath kilometers of accumulated dust and debris. Initial scans suggested the ruins covered an area larger than most Imperial hive cities, with architectural features that incorporated the same crystalline technology found elsewhere in the sector. The rogue trader expedition established a temporary base camp and began systematic excavation using heavy industrial equipment. The excavation work proceeded for months without incident, uncovering layer after layer of ancient construction. The deeper the teams dug, the more sophisticated the technology became. Corridors lined with materials that seemed to absorb light completely, chambers containing geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, control surfaces covered in symbols that shifted and changed when observed through different spectrums of light. The Quintanus archaeologists documented everything meticulously, but their reports failed to convey the growing sense of unease that permeated the dig site. The breakthrough came when excavation teams reached what appeared to be a central command chamber. The room stretched for hundreds of meters in all directions, its walls covered in the same shifting symbols found throughout the complex. At the chamber's center stood a raised platform containing what could only be described as a control interface, though its purpose remained completely opaque to human understanding. When the lead archaeologist attempted to take detailed measurements of the platform, his equipment registered energy readings that spiked beyond all previous recordings. The activation was subtle at first. Lights that had been dark for millions of years began to flicker with pale green illumination. The symbols on the walls started cycling through sequences that suggested some form of startup procedure. Deep beneath the complex, machinery that had been silent since before humanity's first steps into space began to hum with renewed power. The excavation team had less than an hour to evacuate before the entire complex sealed itself, trapping several pieces of heavy equipment beneath rapidly closing blast doors. Similar awakenings began occurring across the sector with increasing frequency. Seismic stations recorded synchronized tremors on worlds separated by dozens of light years, as if some vast network was coming online after eons of dormancy. Industrial accidents on forge worlds increased dramatically, with machinery failing in ways that suggested external interference rather than mechanical breakdown. Most ominously, long-range Auspex arrays began detecting energy signatures moving beneath the surface of multiple worlds, following patterns that implied both intelligence and purpose. The Adeptus Mechanicus response teams dispatched to investigate these phenomena found themselves confronting technology that operated according to principles completely alien to Imperial science. Devices that functioned without detectable power sources. Structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Defensive systems that activated automatically when approached, using weapons that fired concentrated beams of energy that could slice through ceramite armor as easily as flesh. The tech priest's attempts to interface with these systems resulted in catastrophic feedback that destroyed their equipment and, in several cases, left the investigators catatonic. Reports from across the sector began describing similar encounters with increasing frequency. Mining teams on industrial worlds reported finding chambers that had not been there during previous surveys. Agricultural surveyors discovered geometric patterns carved into bedrock that matched no known Imperial construction techniques. Even the void stations began registering anomalous readings from deep space sensors, detecting objects that appeared and disappeared without following predictable orbital mechanics. The true scope of what was awakening beneath the Orpheus Sector remained hidden from Imperial authorities, classified in reports that few outside the highest levels of the Adeptus Mechanicus were authorized to read. But the signs were unmistakable to those who knew how to interpret them. An ancient intelligence was stirring, one that had waited patiently through the rise and fall of countless civilizations for the right moment to reclaim what it considered rightfully its own. The convergence of awakening signals across the Orpheus Sector followed pathways established millions of years before humanity had even developed written language. Deep beneath the surface of dozens of worlds, quantum entanglement networks that had remained dormant since the war in heaven began pulsing with renewed activity. The excavation works had triggered more than just local defensive systems. It had activated a cascade protocol that sent resurrection commands racing through subspace conduits to tomb complexes scattered across the sector's most strategically valuable worlds. At the heart of this vast network lay the primary tomb world of Sarkin, a planet that Imperial surveys had classified as a barren rock unsuitable for colonization. Beneath its lifeless surface stretched necropolis cities that dwarfed the greatest hive worlds of the Imperium, their silent halls containing the slumbering forms of an entire dynasty. The Maynarkh Dynasty had chosen Sarkin as their primary stronghold specifically for its position at the convergence of multiple stable warp routes, allowing them to project power across the region that would eventually become the Orpheus Sector. When the Cascade Awakening began, Sarkin's massive resurrection chambers were among the first to respond. The hierarchical structure of the Maynarkh Dynasty reflected the rigid social order that had existed during their reign as the Necron tier. At its apex stood Pharaon Amenhotep, whose consciousness had survived the biotransference process with remarkable clarity. Unlike many of his peers who had emerged from the Great Sleep as little more than automata driven by base instincts, Amenhotep retained the strategic brilliance and political cunning that had made him one of the most feared rulers of the ancient Necron-tier empire. His personality engrams had been preserved in quantum matrices of unprecedented sophistication, allowing him to maintain not just his memories, but his capacity for complex reasoning and long-term planning. Beneath Amenhotep operated a council of overlords, each responsible for specific aspects of the dynasty's military and administrative functions. Overlord Kutlak commanded the dynasty's terror troops, specializing in psychological warfare and the coordination of flayed one packs. His necrodermis bore the scars of countless battles, deliberately maintained as symbols of his dedication to close combat. Overlord Hemion controlled the dynasty's vast fleets of tomb ships. His consciousness interfaced directly with the vessel's command systems to provide coordination impossible for organic commanders. The Overlord Zarek managed the dynasty's Khatan Shard entities, a role that required both tremendous willpower and intimate knowledge of the star god's fractured psyches. What distinguished the Maynarkh dynasty from their peers was their systematic approach to terror as a military doctrine. While other dynasties viewed fear as a useful byproduct of their campaigns, the Maynarkh had elevated psychological warfare to an art form. Their strategic philosophy held that enemies who destroyed themselves through panic and despair were more efficiently eliminated than those who required direct military engagement. This approach had proven devastatingly effective during the War in Heaven, when entire star systems had surrendered rather than face the dynasty's reputation for creative cruelty. The dynasty's extensive use of flayed ones represented both a tactical advantage and a carefully managed liability. These deranged Necrons, driven mad by the Flayer virus that caused them to believe they could reclaim their lost flesh by wearing the skin of their victims, were typically shunned by other dynasties as uncontrollable aberrations. The Maynarkh, however, had developed techniques for channeling their bloodlust into directed military operations. Specially modified command protocols allowed overlords to guide flayed one packs toward specific targets while maintaining enough autonomy to maximize their psychological impact on enemy forces. The process of awakening across multiple tomb worlds simultaneously created logistical challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser dynasties. Resurrection protocols required precise timing to prevent system overloads, while the reactivation of planetary defense networks demanded coordination across light years of space. The Maynarkh approach involved staged awakenings that began with command hierarchies and gradually expanded to include larger military formations. Priority went to tomb ships and their crews, allowing the dynasty to establish void superiority before committing ground forces to planetary operations. On Sarkin, the primary resurrection chambers began their work with Pharaoh Amenhotep himself. The process took several Terran days as quantum matrices synchronized with necrodermis bodies that had remained in stasis for over 60 million years. Diagnostic systems ran continuous checks on neural pathways and motor functions, while backup personality engrams stood ready to compensate for any data corruption. When Amenhotep finally rose from his sarcophagus, his first actions involved accessing the dynasty's strategic databases to assess the current state of the galaxy and identify immediate threats to his realm. The information gathered by automated monitoring systems during the Great Sleep painted a picture of unprecedented alien infestation. Organic species had not merely survived the galaxy-wide purges of the war in heaven, but had actually proliferated across worlds that rightfully belonged to the Necron dynasties. Most disturbing was the discovery that these newcomers had established extensive industrial infrastructure and military forces capable of interstellar warfare. The humans who had colonized the Orpheus Sector possessed technology that, while primitive by Necron standards, was sufficiently advanced to pose a threat to isolated tomb complexes during their vulnerable awakening phases. Amenhotep's strategic assessment identified the need for immediate action to secure the dynasty's territorial claims before the organic infestation could spread further. The Maynarkh military doctrine called for swift, overwhelming strikes designed to break enemy morale and prevent organized resistance. Terror tactics would be employed not just for their psychological effect, but as force multipliers that allowed relatively small Necron forces to control much larger populations through fear and intimidation. The coordination between tomb worlds required sophisticated communication networks that operated through quantum entanglement and subspace resonance. Command signals traveled instantaneously between designated relay points, allowing overlords on different worlds to synchronize their awakening schedules and coordinate initial military operations. The system's redundancy meant that even if several tomb complexes were discovered and attacked during their vulnerable startup phases, the remaining sites could continue operations and eventually mount rescue efforts. Military doctrine within the Maynarkh Dynasty emphasized the integration of different Necron unit types to maximize their combined effectiveness. Immortals provided the backbone of most formations, their disciplined ranks advancing with mechanical precision while maintaining devastating firepower. Warriors formed the bulk of assault forces, their simple but effective programming making them ideal for overwhelming enemy positions through sheer numbers. Destroyers operated as mobile fire support, their anti-gravity platforms allowing them to strike from unexpected angles while avoiding return fire. The dynasty's relationship with their Khatan Shard entities represented one of their most significant strategic advantages. Unlike many dynasties who viewed their star god fragments as dangerous but necessary weapons, the Maynarkh had developed sophisticated containment and control systems that allowed for more flexible deployment. The Deceiver Shard bound to the dynasty specialized in creating false intelligence and manipulating enemy communications, often causing Imperial forces to attack each other or abandon strategic positions based on fabricated orders. The Nightbringer Shard served as the ultimate terror weapon, its mere presence on a battlefield sufficient to break the morale of all but the most disciplined enemy forces. Flayed One coordination presented unique challenges that the Maynarkh had spent millennia perfecting. These afflicted Necrons retained enough of their original tactical programming to follow basic commands, but their obsession with claiming organic flesh made them unpredictable in combat situations. Maynarkh overlords used specialized command protocols that directed the Flayed One's hunger towards specific enemy units while maintaining enough control to prevent them from attacking friendly forces or civilians marked for capture rather than elimination. The initial tomb ship launches began simultaneously across 17 different worlds, each vessel emerging from concealed hangar bays that had remained hidden beneath planetary surfaces for millions of years. These ships represented the pinnacle of Necron void warfare technology, their hulls constructed from living metal that could repair damage automatically, while their weapon systems drew power directly from captive stellar fragments. The ship's crews consisted entirely of Necrons who had volunteered for permanent integration with their vessel's control systems. Their consciousness merged with machine spirits to create hybrid entities capable of superhuman coordination and reaction times. Navigation systems aboard the tomb ships accessed stellar cartography databases that predated human civilization by millions of years. Ancient star charts showed the positions of celestial bodies with mathematical precision, while quantum sensors detected gravitational anomalies and warp current fluctuations that allowed for more efficient interstellar travel than anything available to Imperial forces. The ships moved through space with predatory patience, their advanced stealth systems rendering them invisible to all but the most sophisticated detection equipment. The systematic extermination of Imperial outposts began with targets selected for maximum psychological impact rather than strategic value. Remote monitoring stations and mining facilities on the sector's rim worlds offered minimal military resistance, but served important roles in the Imperium's communication and supply networks. Their destruction would create gaps in Imperial intelligence gathering, while demonstrating the futility of resistance against Necron technology. The attack on mining station Tertius 7 in the Chrono system established the pattern that would be repeated across dozens of installations. The tomb ship Eternal Requiem approached the facility using gravitic manipulation to mask its sensor signature, appearing to automated detection systems as nothing more than a large asteroid. When the ship dropped its stealth protocols and opened fire, the station's defensive systems had less than 30 seconds to respond before coherent energy beams sliced through their void shields and hull plating. The station's crew of 3,000 workers and security personnel found themselves facing an enemy that operated according to principles completely outside their experience. Teleportation attacks materialized Necron warriors directly inside critical facilities, bypassing defensive positions and creating chaos throughout the complex. Flayed ones stalked through maintenance corridors, their claws leaving distinctive marks on bulkheads, while their victims' screams echoed through communication systems. The few survivors who managed to reach escape pods carried with them accounts of mechanical horrors that defied rational explanation. Similar attacks struck mining facilities, communication relays, and supply depots across the sector's periphery. Each assault demonstrated new aspects of Necron capabilities while maintaining the psychological warfare focus that characterized Maynarkh operations. Some installations were completely destroyed, leaving only debris fields and radiation signatures as evidence of their existence. Others were left partially intact, but filled with the flayed corpses of their crews, arranged in geometric patterns that served no apparent tactical purpose, but created lasting impressions on Imperial rescue teams. The Maynarkh approach to these initial strikes involved careful documentation of Imperial responses and capabilities. Sensor arrays aboard tomb ships recorded detailed information about Imperial ship designs, weapon systems, and tactical doctrines. Communication intercepts provided intelligence about command structures and strategic priorities. Most importantly, the attack served as field tests for Necron equipment and tactics that had not been used in active combat for millions of years. The integration of Khatan shard entities into these operations required precise coordination between overlords and the specialized containment systems that prevented the star god fragments from breaking free of their bonds. The Deceiver Shard proved particularly effective at manipulating Imperial communication networks, inserting false distress calls and contradictory orders that confused rescue efforts and delayed organized responses. Its ability to assume the appearance of Imperial personnel allowed it to infiltrate facilities and gather intelligence while sowing distrust among human forces. Terror tactics employed during these attacks went beyond simple intimidation to create lasting psychological trauma that would spread throughout Imperial forces in the sector. Flayed ones were deployed not just as shock troops, but as instruments of psychological warfare, their distinctive claw marks and skinning techniques creating signature calling cards that identified Maynarkh involvement. Survivors were often allowed to escape specifically to carry accounts of the attacks back to Imperial command centers, where their testimonies would demoralize other personnel and create atmosphere of helpless dread. The declaration of reclamation that these attacks represented went beyond mere territorial conquest to encompass the restoration of an ancient order that predated human civilization. From the Maynarkh perspective, the organic species that had colonized their former domains were nothing more than vermin that had infested abandoned buildings. The systematic extermination of Imperial outposts served notice that the rightful owners had returned and would tolerate no further trespass on their ancestral holdings. The Orpheus Sector's strategic significance to the Imperium extended far beyond its considerable industrial capacity and agricultural output. Positioned at the confluence of three major warp routes that connected the Segmentum Solar to the eastern fringe, the sector served as a critical way station for Imperial Navy fleets conducting long-range patrols and Astra Militarum forces deploying to combat zones across the galaxy's outer reaches. The sector's forge worlds produced specialized components for void ship construction that were essential to maintaining the Imperial Navy's operational readiness, while its agri-worlds fed populations across 17 neighboring sectors. The loss of mining stations and communication relays along the sector's rim initially appeared to Imperial authorities as isolated incidents rather than coordinated attacks. Pirates and Xenos raiders had plagued the region's outer systems for decades, making the destruction of remote facilities a relatively common occurrence. However, the distinctive nature of the attacks began to draw attention from Sector Command on Orpheus Prime. Survivors' accounts described weapons technology that far exceeded anything in known pirate arsenals, while the systematic nature of the strikes suggested planning capabilities beyond typical raider operations. Lord Commander Militant Thaddeus Hack received his appointment to lead the Imperial response through a combination of political maneuvering and genuine military competence. A veteran of the Damocles Gulf Crusade and the Badab War, Hack had built his reputation on methodical planning and the effective coordination of multi-regiment operations. His experience fighting Tau forces had given him insights into combating technologically superior enemies, while his involvement in suppressing the Astral Claws rebellion had demonstrated his ability to maintain loyalty among diverse Imperial forces under difficult circumstances. The formation of the Orphean War Council represented a significant escalation in the Imperial response to the growing crisis. Hack's authority extended across military, naval, and civilian administrative functions within the sector, granting him powers normally reserved for Warmaster-level appointments. The council included representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus Forge Worlds, the Imperial Navy's Sector Fleet Command, and their Administratum's Colonial Governance Division. This unprecedented concentration of authority reflected the growing recognition that the Orpheus Sector faced threats requiring coordinated responses across multiple Imperial institutions. Initial Astra Militarum deployments drew regiments from 6 neighboring sectors, each contributing forces based on their specialized capabilities and current operational availability. The Mordian Iron Guard provided disciplined line infantry, renowned for their parade ground precision and unwavering morale under fire. The Talern Desert Raiders brought expertise in mobile warfare and reconnaissance operations that would prove valuable in the sector's varied terrain. Vestroyan Firstborn regiments contributed heavy weapons specialists and veteran sergeants whose experience in urban warfare complemented the other forces' capabilities. The Cadian shock troops formed the backbone of the initial deployment, their regiments drawn from the Fortress World's seemingly inexhaustible reserves of trained soldiers. These forces brought standardized equipment and tactical doctrines that served as the foundation for combined operations involving multiple regiment types. Their officers had extensive experience coordinating with other Imperial forces, making them natural choices for command positions in mixed unit formations. Catachan jungle fighters arrived with specialized knowledge of guerrilla warfare and survival in hostile environments. Their unconventional tactics and independence of spirit created friction with more traditional regiments, but their effectiveness in reconnaissance and sabotage operations made them valuable assets for operations in contested territory. The Catachans' experience fighting in environments where conventional Imperial doctrine proved inadequate would become increasingly relevant as the nature of the enemy became clear. The Steel Legion regiments from Armageddon brought mechanized infantry capabilities and extensive experience in combined arms operations. Their Chimera transports and supporting Leman Russ battle tanks provided the mobile firepower needed for rapid response to attacks across the sector's multiple worlds. The Steel Legion's doctrine emphasized speed and aggressive assault tactics that contrasted sharply with the more methodical approaches favored by other regiments. Early engagements on the world of Solemnus demonstrated the steep learning curve Imperial forces faced when confronting Necron technology and tactics. The planet's primary mining complex had gone silent after reporting unusual seismic activity in the deep extraction zones. When the Mordian 423rd Regiment deployed to investigate, they found the facility's defensive perimeter intact but completely abandoned. The miners' quarters showed signs of hasty evacuation, with personal belongings scattered and meals left half-finished in the communal dining areas. The Mordian advance into the mining complex proceeded according to standard Imperial doctrine for clearing potentially hostile facilities. Infantry squads moved in coordinated formations, while heavy weapons teams established overwatch positions to provide covering fire. Vox Communications maintained constant contact between units as they methodically searched each level of the complex. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when advanced scouts reported finding geometric patterns carved into the facility's metal flooring. The cuts so precise they appeared to have been made by industrial cutting equipment rather than weapons. Contact with Necron forces began when flayed ones emerged from ventilation systems and maintenance corridors throughout the complex. The creature's ability to phase through solid matter allowed them to bypass the Mordians' carefully established defensive positions and attack from unexpected directions. Their claws, energized by the same technology that powered Necron weapons, sliced through flak armor and carapace plating with equal ease. The psychological impact of facing enemies that wore the flayed skin of previous victims proved as devastating as their physical capabilities. The Mordian response demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional Imperial Guard tactics when facing Necron opponents. Disciplined volley fire from Law's weapons proved capable of damaging Necron warriors, but the aliens' self-repair capabilities meant that anything less than complete destruction resulted in enemies returning to combat within minutes. Heavy weapons teams found their las cannons and auto cannons more effective, but the Necrons' ability to teleport and phase through cover made it difficult to maintain target acquisition long enough for sustained fire. Imperial tactical doctrine emphasized the importance of holding defensive positions and maintaining unit cohesion under fire. Against conventional enemies, these principles had proven effective across thousands of battlefields throughout the galaxy. However, Necron teleportation technology and phase capabilities rendered traditional defensive positions meaningless. Troops who attempted to hold fortified locations found themselves surrounded by enemies who had simply materialized behind their lines, while retreat became impossible when flayed ones could pursue through solid walls and closed doors. The engagement at Mining Complex Tertius lasted 18 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of 2 Mordian companies before the surviving forces managed to establish a defensive perimeter outside the facility. Casualty reports documented weapon wounds unlike anything in Imperial medical databases, with injuries that showed signs of molecular disruption rather than conventional trauma. Survivors described enemies that continued fighting despite suffering damage that should have been immediately fatal, their mechanical bodies repairing themselves even as Imperial forces watched. Operations on Drazak presented different challenges that highlighted additional aspects of Necron capabilities. The world's primary starport had been attacked by what initial reports described as a single enemy vessel of unknown configuration. Imperial Navy patrol craft dispatched to investigate found the facility's void shields collapsed and its landing platforms covered in a crystalline substance that defied analysis. The substance appeared to be some form of solidified energy that had cooled into geometric patterns resembling circuit boards or neural networks. The Tallarn 15th Armored Regiment deployed to Drazak with orders to secure the starport and establish a base of operations for follow-up forces. Their Leman Russ battle tanks and Chimera transports provided the mobility and firepower needed to deal with what appeared to be a relatively small enemy force. The regiment's reconnaissance elements reported no visible enemy activity around the starport, but their Auspex readings detected energy signatures moving beneath the facility's foundations. The Tallarn advance proceeded cautiously, with scout units probing potential ambush sites while the main force maintained supporting positions. The regiment's experience in desert warfare had taught them to be suspicious of apparently empty terrain, a lesson that proved valuable when dealing with enemies capable of remaining hidden until the moment of attack. Forward observers reported finding vehicle wreckage that had been precisely disassembled rather than destroyed, with components sorted into neat piles according to function and material composition. Necron tomb spiders emerged from concealed positions beneath the starport's main terminal building, their multi-limbed forms moving with mechanical precision as they began constructing defensive positions from salvaged Imperial equipment. These creatures combine the functions of combat engineers and automated repair systems. They're built-in fabrication tools capable of converting raw materials into functional fortifications within minutes. The Tallarn forces found themselves facing enemy positions that grew stronger even as they watched, with defensive barriers rising from the ground and weapon emplacements appearing in locations that had been empty moments before. The battle for Drazak's starport demonstrated the effectiveness of Imperial armored doctrine when properly applied against Necron forces. Leman Russ battle cannons proved capable of destroying tomb spiders with direct hits, while the tank's thick armor provided protection against most Necron's small arms fire. However, the aliens' heavy weapons, including particle casters and heat rays, could penetrate even the heaviest Imperial armor with relative ease. Tank crews learned to maintain constant movement and avoid presenting stationary targets, tactics that went against traditional Imperial armored doctrine but proved necessary for survival. The arrival of Space Marine strike forces marked a significant escalation in the Imperial response to the growing crisis. The Ultramarines' Second Company, led by Captain Titus Ventress, brought expertise in combined arms operations and the tactical flexibility needed to adapt quickly to new enemy capabilities. Their power armor provided better protection against Necron weapons than standard Imperial Guard equipment, while their bolters' mass reactive shells proved more effective at causing the catastrophic damage needed to prevent Necron self-repair systems from functioning. Imperial Fist's forces from the Third Company specialized in siege warfare and defensive operations, skills that proved valuable in establishing secure bases of operations on contested worlds. Their expertise in fortification construction and defensive planning helped Imperial forces create strongpoints that could withstand Necron attacks long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Imperial Fist's methodical approach to warfare complemented the more aggressive tactics employed by other Space Marine chapters, providing stability and coordination for combined operations. Raven Guard strike teams brought stealth capabilities and reconnaissance expertise that proved essential for gathering intelligence about Necron operations. Their ability to infiltrate enemy positions and conduct sabotage missions provided Imperial forces with tactical advantages that helped offset the aliens' technological superiority. The Raven Guard's experience in guerrilla warfare and unconventional tactics offered alternative approaches to the direct confrontation that had proven so costly in early engagements. The adaptation of Space Marine tactics to anti-Xenos warfare required significant modifications to standard Codex Astartes doctrine. Traditional assault tactics that relied on shock and overwhelming force proved less effective against enemies that felt no fear and could repair battle damage automatically. Space Marine commanders learned to focus their attacks on complete destruction of enemy units rather than the suppression and demoralization that worked against human opponents. Specialized anti-Xenos equipment began arriving with the Space Marine reinforcements, including weapons and ammunition types specifically designed for use against Necron forces. Kraken pattern bolter rounds with enhanced penetration capabilities proved more effective at causing the structural damage needed to prevent self-repair. Plasma weapons, despite their inherent risks, became standard equipment for squads expected to engage Necron heavy infantry. Melta weapons proved particularly effective against Necron vehicles and constructs, their intense heat capable of causing molecular breakdown that overwhelmed even advanced self-repair systems. The coordination between Astra Militarum and Space Marine forces required careful planning to maximize the strengths of each force type while minimizing their weaknesses. Imperial Guard regiments provided the numbers and sustained firepower needed for prolonged engagements, while Space Marines served as rapid response forces capable of dealing with specific threats or exploiting tactical opportunities. This division of roles proved more effective than attempts to integrate the forces at lower command levels, where differences in equipment and tactical doctrine created coordination problems. Early battles on Borsis demonstrated the importance of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance in operations against Necron forces. The world's industrial centers had been systematically attacked by small Necron forces that appeared and disappeared without warning, striking at critical infrastructure before vanishing into the planet's extensive cave systems. Imperial forces found themselves fighting an enemy that possessed perfect knowledge of the terrain while remaining almost completely invisible to Imperial reconnaissance efforts. The Catachan 23rd Regiment's deployment to Borsis represented an attempt to match Necron stealth capabilities with Imperial expertise in unconventional warfare. The jungle fighters' experience in hostile environments and their ability to operate independently of conventional supply lines made them ideal candidates for pursuing enemy forces into terrain that would challenge more traditional regiments. Their scouts reported finding Necron constructs that had been dormant for unknown periods, their systems activating only when Imperial forces approached specific locations or performed certain actions. The systematic conversion of Imperial worlds into Necron tomb complexes represented a form of warfare that transcended conventional military conquest. Where traditional Xenos invasions sought to claim territory through the destruction of defending forces, the Maynarkh Dynasty implemented a methodical process of technological assimilation that transformed entire planetary infrastructures into extensions of their ancient empire. This process began with the activation of dolmen gates, massive stone archways that had remained buried beneath Imperial settlements for millennia, their true purpose hidden from human understanding until the moment of their awakening. The dolmen gates served as more than simple transportation devices, functioning as quantum tunnels that connected distant tomb worlds through dimensions that existed parallel to real space. Each gate required precise calibration to establish stable connections across interstellar distances, with the process involving gravitational manipulation on scales that dwarfed anything in the Imperial arsenal. When activated, the gates created localized distortions in spacetime that allowed Necron forces to deploy directly onto target worlds without the vulnerabilities associated with orbital assault or void warfare. The technological horror of these operations became apparent as Imperial reconnaissance teams discovered the fate of settlements that had simply vanished from communication networks. On the agri-world of Demeter Secundus, an entire hive city of 12 million inhabitants had been transformed into a necropolis complex within a matter of days. The city's towering spires remained structurally intact, but their interiors had been gutted and rebuilt according to Necron architectural principles. Corridors that had once bustled with human activity now stretched in perfect geometric patterns, their walls lined with alcoves designed to house the mechanical forms of the dynasty's warriors. The conversion process involved the systematic harvesting of organic populations through biotransference facilities that operated according to principles that violated every known law of physics and biology. These installations, discovered by Imperial forces in the deepest levels of converted structures, contained machinery that could separate consciousness from flesh with surgical precision. Unlike the ancient biotransference that had transformed the Necrontyr into their mechanical forms, these facilities served a different purpose: the extraction of human neural patterns for integration into servitor constructs and specialized combat units. Imperial forces entering these facilities found chambers lined with crystalline matrices that pulsed with sickly green light, each one containing the preserved consciousness of a human victim. The matrices themselves defied analysis by Imperial tech adepts, their internal structures shifting between quantum states that made direct observation impossible. When Imperial personnel attempted to interface with the devices using standard Mechanicus protocols, the results proved catastrophic. Several tech priests suffered complete neural breakdown as their augmetic systems were overwhelmed by data streams that operated according to non-human logic patterns. The fate of populations subjected to this process varied according to the dynasty's immediate tactical requirements. Skilled technicians and engineers found their consciousness patterns extracted and implanted into mechanical constructs that retained their technical knowledge while stripping away their humanity and free will. These hybrid entities possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial technology and infrastructure, making them invaluable for sabotage operations and the conversion of captured facilities to Necron specifications. Industrial workers and manual laborers underwent a different form of processing that transformed them into mindless automata capable of performing complex construction tasks without supervision or rest. These constructs retained enough of their original motor functions to operate Imperial machinery, but their consciousness had been reduced to basic programming that made them incapable of independent thought or resistance. Imperial forces encountering these abominations often recognized former comrades among their ranks, their faces still recognizable despite the mechanical components that had replaced their organic nervous systems. The most horrific fate awaited those deemed unsuitable for mechanical conversion. These individuals were subjected to experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of biotransference technology beyond anything attempted during the war in heaven. The Maynarkh Dynasty's research into consciousness manipulation had continued throughout their great sleep, with automated systems conducting millions of theoretical experiments on preserved neural patterns. The awakening provided opportunities to test these theories on living subjects, with results that defied both Imperial medical knowledge and basic concepts of biological possibility. Hive Primus on Orpheus Prime represented the largest population center to fall victim to the dynasty's conversion protocols. The Hive City's 43 billion inhabitants had made it a tempting target for large-scale biotransference experiments, while its position as the sector's administrative center provided access to critical intelligence about Imperial defensive capabilities. The city's fall began with seismic disturbances that Imperial authorities initially attributed to tectonic activity caused by the Hive's massive industrial operations. The true source of the disturbances became apparent when dolmen gates began emerging from the Hive's foundation levels, their massive stone structures rising through hab blocks and industrial complexes with inexorable force. The gate's activation created gravitational anomalies that pulled entire city sections into dimensional vortices, while their emergence points became beachheads for Necron forces teleporting directly into the Hive's most heavily populated areas. The defense of Hive Primus involved every available Imperial force in the sector, with Astra Militarum regiments, Space Marine companies, and Adeptus Mechanicus battle servitors coordinating desperate holding actions across multiple Hive levels simultaneously. The city's vertical structure, which normally provided defensive advantages against conventional assault, became a liability when facing enemies capable of teleporting through solid matter and attacking from any direction. Imperial forces found themselves fighting on dozens of fronts simultaneously, with enemy forces appearing behind established defensive lines without warning. The Mordian Iron Guard's 15th Regiment established defensive positions in the Hive's middle levels, their disciplined firing lines creating killing zones that channeled Necron advances into predetermined engagement areas. However, the aliens' ability to phase through walls and floors made traditional defensive tactics ineffective. Necron warriors would materialize within the Mordians' ranks, their Gauss weapons stripping flesh from bone, while their mechanical forms proved resistant to Law's weapon fire that would have devastated human opponents. Flayed ones stalked through the Hive's maintenance systems and service corridors, their madness driving them to seek out isolated groups of civilians and military personnel. The creatures' ability to wear the flayed skin of their victims allowed them to infiltrate Imperial positions by impersonating known personnel, a tactic that created paranoia and mistrust among defending forces. Guard units began implementing increasingly stringent identification protocols, but the flayed one's perfect mimicry of human appearance made detection nearly impossible until the moment of attack. The Ultramarines' 4th Company, led by Captain Uriel Ventress, attempted to establish a secure perimeter around the Hive's primary command center. Their tactical expertise and superior equipment allowed them to maintain cohesive formations despite the chaotic nature of the battle, but even Space Marine power armor provided limited protection against Gauss weapons that could strip away molecular bonds at the atomic level. The company's Devastator squads found that their heavy weapons, while effective against individual Necron units, proved insufficient against the sheer numbers of enemies teleporting into the combat zone. The systematic conversion of Hive Primus proceeded level by level as Necron forces secured areas and began installing biotransference equipment. The process required several days to complete, during which Imperial forces mounted increasingly desperate counterattacks to prevent the facility's activation. These assaults revealed the true scale of the Necron operation, with entire Hive sections being restructured to accommodate massive conversion chambers that could process thousands of subjects simultaneously. Imperial forces penetrating the converted areas discovered biotransference facilities that operated on an industrial scale previously unimaginable. Assembly lines of crystalline matrices processed human consciousness patterns with mechanical efficiency, while automated systems sorted the extracted neural data according to criteria that remained opaque to Imperial understanding. The facility's power requirements drew energy directly from the planet's core through gravitational manipulation systems that created localized space-time distortions. The discovery of these facilities prompted immediate consultation with the highest levels of Imperial command regarding the implementation of exterminatus protocols. The systematic conversion of human populations into mechanical constructs represented a form of Xenos contamination that traditional Imperial doctrine classified as requiring planetary sterilization. However, the Orpheus Sector's strategic importance to the Imperium's broader military operations created complications that prevented the simple application of standard protocols. The sector's forge worlds produced critical components for Imperial Navy vessels operating across 3 segmentums, while their loss would create supply shortages that could compromise military operations across dozens of neighboring sectors. The agri-worlds provided food supplies for over 50 Imperial worlds. Their destruction would create famine conditions that could destabilize entire subsectors. Most critically, the sector's position along major warp routes made it essential for Imperial Navy operations in the Eastern Fringe, where ongoing campaigns against Tau expansion and Tyranid Hive fleets required constant reinforcement and resupply. Lord Commander Hack's strategic assessment concluded that the sector's value to the Imperium outweighed the risks associated with prolonged ground campaigns against Necron forces. This decision committed Imperial forces to a grinding war of attrition that would test every aspect of their military capabilities, while providing the Necrons with opportunities to refine their conversion technologies through continued experimentation on captured populations. The prolonged nature of the conflict allowed Imperial forces to develop new tactical approaches specifically designed for anti-Necron warfare. Combined arms operations that integrated Space Marine strike capabilities with Imperial Guard firepower proved more effective than either force type operating independently. The Space Marines' mobility and heavy weapons provided the concentrated force needed to destroy Necron units completely, while Imperial Guard formations supplied the sustained firepower necessary to prevent enemy forces from regrouping and repairing battle damage. Specialized equipment began arriving from Forge worlds across the Imperium as the Adeptus Mechanicus developed new weapons and ammunition types specifically for use against Necron forces. Plasma weapons proved particularly effective due to their ability to cause molecular disruption that overwhelmed self-repair systems, though their tendency to overheat and explode created additional risks for Imperial forces. Melta-weapons could destroy even the most heavily armored Necron constructs, but their short range made them difficult to employ effectively against enemies capable of long-range teleportation. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy that converted captured personnel into mechanical abominations created morale problems that Imperial commanders struggled to address through conventional means. Troops who witnessed the fate of captured comrades often suffered breakdowns that rendered them combat ineffective, while the knowledge that death might not provide escape from enemy experimentation created fatalistic attitudes that undermined unit cohesion. Commissars found themselves executing increasing numbers of personnel for cowardice or defeatism, but these measures failed to address the underlying psychological trauma caused by exposure to Necron conversion facilities. The Adeptus Mechanicus response to the discovery of Necron biotransference technology revealed deep divisions within the organization regarding the appropriate response to Xeno's technological superiority. Conservative factions viewed the alien technology as an abomination that threatened the purity of the Omnissiah's teachings, while more radical elements saw opportunities to advance human understanding through careful study of Necron principles. These philosophical differences created coordination problems that hampered Imperial efforts to develop effective countermeasures against Necron conversion protocols. Tech adept Coriel Zeth's analysis of captured Necron technology provided insights into the aliens' approach to consciousness manipulation and mechanical integration. Her reports described devices that operated according to principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter, with implications that extended far beyond immediate military applications. However, her research also revealed the dangers inherent in attempting to understand technologies developed by civilizations whose thought processes operated according to completely alien logic systems. The fortification of Imperial positions on contested worlds required adaptations to standard defensive doctrine that took into account Necron teleportation and phase capabilities. Traditional bunker systems and trench networks proved ineffective against enemies that could bypass physical barriers through dimensional manipulation. Imperial engineers began developing new fortification designs that incorporated multiple redundant defensive layers and rapid response protocols designed to contain teleportation attacks before they could spread throughout defensive complexes. The emergence of Pharaon Amontech from his sarcophagus on Sarkin marked the beginning of a campaign that would demonstrate the full scope of Necron strategic thinking when applied by a mind that had retained its pre-biotransference brilliance. Unlike many of his dynasty peers, who had awakened as hollow shells driven by base programming, Amontech possessed the intellectual capacity to analyze the current galactic situation and adapt ancient Necron military doctrine to address threats that had not existed during the war in heaven. His first acts upon awakening involved accessing the dynasty's vast databases to understand how the galaxy had changed during the Great Sleep, paying particular attention to the technological capabilities and military organization of the organic species that had infested former Necron territories. Amontech's approach to warfare reflected his understanding that the Maynarkh Dynasty faced enemies whose numbers far exceeded their own awakened forces. Traditional Necron tactics that relied on overwhelming technological superiority would prove insufficient against Imperial forces that could replace their losses through recruitment from populations numbering in the trillions. Instead, the Pharaon developed a strategic philosophy that emphasized the systematic destruction of enemy morale and command structures through carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror and technological demonstration. The Pharaon's personal vendetta against the Imperium stemmed from more than simple territorial disputes over former Necron worlds. His analysis of Imperial expansion patterns revealed a species that had not merely occupied abandoned territories, but had actively sought out and destroyed archaeological evidence of previous civilizations. Forge worlds throughout the sector contained vaults filled with Necron artifacts that had been stripped from their original contexts and subjected to crude attempts at reverse engineering. These discoveries represented a form of cultural desecration that violated the most fundamental principles of Necron civilization. Amontech's strategic planning incorporated chronotech technology that allowed the dynasty to manipulate temporal flows around key battlefields. These devices, relics of the war in heaven that had been carefully maintained throughout the Great Sleep, could create localized time distortions that gave Necron forces significant tactical advantages. Enemy projectiles could be slowed to the point where they became easily avoidable, while Necron movements could be accelerated to achieve coordination impossible for organic nervous systems to match. The Battle of Thanatos Ridge demonstrated Amontech's mastery of temporal manipulation in large-scale engagements. The Cadian 47th Armored Regiment had established defensive positions along a series of elevated ridgelines that provided excellent fields of fire against approaching enemy forces. Their Leman Russ battle tanks and supporting artillery pieces created overlapping kill zones that should have made any direct assault prohibitively costly. However, when the Necron attack began, Imperial gunners found their targeting systems unable to track enemies that seemed to flicker in and out of normal time. Chronotech fields surrounding advancing Necron formations created temporal bubbles where cause and effect operated according to different rules than the surrounding battlefield. Artillery shells fired at Necron positions would impact several seconds before the guns that fired them had completed their firing sequences, creating paradoxes that overloaded Imperial targeting cogitators. Tank crews reported seeing enemy forces in multiple positions simultaneously, their visual cortexes unable to process the temporal distortions that allowed Necrons to exist in several moments at once. The psychological impact of fighting enemies that could manipulate time itself proved as devastating as the tactical advantages these abilities provided. Imperial troops witnessed their own weapons fire traveling backwards through time to strike targets that had already moved to different positions. Wounded Necron warriors would suddenly appear unwounded, while their damaged forms flickered out of existence, suggesting that the injuries had been prevented rather than healed. These violations of causality created mental strain that pushed many Imperial personnel beyond their psychological breaking points. Amontech's personal combat capabilities had been enhanced during the biotransference process with systems that allowed him to interface directly with chronotech technology. His necrodermis body contained quantum processors that could calculate temporal manipulation equations in real time, while his consciousness existed in a state of temporal flux that made him effectively immune to many forms of attack. Weapons fire directed at the Pharaon would often pass through empty space as his form shifted between different temporal states, while his own attacks could strike enemies before they had committed to the actions that would bring them into his targeting range. The Pharaon's strategic use of terror tactics went beyond simple intimidation to encompass sophisticated psychological warfare designed to exploit specific weaknesses in human psychology. His study of captured Imperial personnel had revealed patterns of thought and emotional response that could be manipulated through carefully designed stimuli. The systematic skinning and display of captured soldiers served not just to demoralize enemy forces, but to trigger specific phobic responses that would spread through Imperial ranks like a contagion. Lord Commander Militant Thaddeus hacks evolution from a conventional Imperial officer to a specialist in Xenos warfare, reflected the adaptive pressures created by prolonged exposure to Necron tactical capabilities. His early career had been built on mastery of standard Imperial Guard doctrine, with particular expertise in the coordination of multi-regiment operations and the integration of supporting elements from other Imperial organizations. However, the unique challenges posed by Necron forces required him to abandon many fundamental assumptions about warfare that had served him well in previous campaigns. Hack's first major engagement against Necron forces on the world of Damnos Tertius demonstrated both his tactical competence and the limitations of conventional Imperial doctrine when applied to Xenos warfare. His initial deployment followed standard protocols for planetary assault operations, with orbital bombardment preparing landing zones for ground forces, while void superiority prevented enemy reinforcement. However, Necron teleportation technology rendered these preparations meaningless, as enemy forces simply materialized behind Imperial lines without using any detectable transportation methods. The Lord Commander's adaptation to anti-Xenos warfare began with his recognition that Necron forces operated according to principles that made traditional concepts of logistics and supply lines irrelevant. Imperial forces required constant resupply of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, creating vulnerable supply trains that could be targeted by enemy raiders. Necron forces, by contrast, operated with complete independence from external support, their weapons drawing power from internal sources, while their mechanical bodies required no sustenance or medical attention. Hack's development of new tactical doctrines involved extensive consultation with Space Marine commanders who possessed greater experience fighting technologically superior enemies. Captain Cato Sicarius of the Ultramarines provided insights into rapid deployment tactics that could respond quickly to Necron teleportation attacks, while Captain K. von Shrike of the Raven Guard contributed expertise in stealth operations and reconnaissance techniques that could gather intelligence about enemy movements despite their advanced sensor capabilities. The Lord Commander's evolution into a Xenos warfare specialist required him to overcome institutional resistance from Imperial Guard officers who viewed deviation from established doctrine as dangerous precedent. His implementation of mixed unit tactics that integrated different regiment types at the squad level violated traditional organizational principles that emphasized regimental identity and standardized equipment. However, the effectiveness of these approaches in actual combat gradually convinced skeptical officers that adaptation was necessary for survival against Necron forces. Hack's personal transformation extended beyond tactical innovation to encompass a fundamental shift in his understanding of Imperial military philosophy. His early career had been built on the assumption that Imperial forces possessed inherent advantages in numbers, industrial capacity, and divine favor that would ultimately ensure victory against any enemy. Prolonged exposure to Necron capabilities forced him to confront the possibility that the Imperium faced enemies whose technological superiority might prove insurmountable through conventional means. The role of tech marines and tech priests in developing countermeasures to Necron technology represented one of the most critical aspects of the Imperial war effort. These individuals possessed the technical expertise necessary to analyze captured Xenos equipment and develop new weapons and defensive systems specifically designed for anti-Necron operations. However, their work required them to study technologies that operated according to principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Magos Dominus Castrius Vex emerged as the leading Imperial expert on Necron technology through his systematic analysis of equipment recovered from battlefield sites across the sector. His Forge World laboratory on Metallica Secundus contained the most comprehensive collection of Necron artifacts outside of the dynasty's own tomb complexes, with specimens ranging from basic warrior weaponry to fragments of advanced command systems. Vex's research approach combined traditional Mechanicus analytical methods with innovative techniques developed specifically for studying non-human technology. The Magos Dominus faced significant challenges in his attempts to understand Necron engineering principles. The aliens' technology incorporated materials that existed in quantum superposition states, making direct analysis impossible without specialized equipment that did not exist in Imperial arsenals. Their weapon systems drew power from sources that appeared to violate conservation of energy laws, while their control interfaces responded to neural patterns that differed fundamentally from human brain activity. Vex's breakthrough came through his development of indirect analysis techniques that studied Necron technology's effects rather than its internal mechanisms. By observing how Gauss weapons interacted with different materials and energy fields, he was able to deduce the underlying principles that governed their operation. This approach led to the creation of specialized armor plating that could provide limited protection against molecular disruption effects, though the materials required for its production remained extremely rare and expensive. The development of effective countermeasures required collaboration between multiple Forge worlds, each contributing specialized knowledge and manufacturing capabilities. Forge World Lucius provided expertise in exotic materials science, while Mars contributed theoretical frameworks for understanding technologies that operated outside normal physical laws. The coordination of these efforts required unprecedented levels of cooperation between Forge worlds that traditionally guarded their technological secrets jealously. Vex's research team discovered that Necron self-repair systems could be disrupted through specific electromagnetic frequency patterns that interfered with their quantum coherence fields. This discovery led to the development of specialized ammunition types that incorporated electromagnetic pulse generators, though their effectiveness varied significantly depending on the specific Necron unit types being engaged. Warriors and immortals proved vulnerable to these weapons, while more advanced constructs possessed shielding systems that rendered them immune to electromagnetic interference. The political dynamics within the Maynarkh Dynasty during the campaign revealed the complex hierarchical relationships that governed Necron society. Unlike the monolithic command structure that Imperial forces expected from mechanical beings, the dynasty operated according to feudal principles that had been preserved from their pre-biotransference civilization. Overlords maintained semi-autonomous control over their assigned territories and forces, while owing allegiance to higher-ranking nobles who could command their support for larger military operations. Overlord Kutlak's specialization in terror warfare made him one of Amontech's most valuable subordinates, but their relationship involved constant tension over strategic priorities and resource allocation. Kutlak's preference for prolonged psychological campaigns that gradually broke enemy morale often conflicted with the Pharaon's need for rapid territorial conquest. These disagreements were resolved through formal duels that followed ancient Necrontyr protocols, with the victor gaining temporary authority over disputed resources or strategic decisions. The coordination of Flayed One packs represented one of Kutlak's most significant contributions to the dynasty's military capabilities. These afflicted Necrons retained enough of their original tactical programming to follow basic commands, but their obsession with claiming organic flesh made them unpredictable in combat situations. Kutlak developed specialized command protocols that channeled their bloodlust towards specific enemy units while maintaining enough control to prevent them from attacking friendly forces or valuable prisoners. Overlord Hemion's control of the dynasty's tomb ship fleets required him to balance the competing demands of multiple simultaneous operations across different star systems. His consciousness had been partially integrated with the command systems of the flagship Eternal Requiem, allowing him to coordinate fleet movements with precision impossible for organic commanders. However, this integration came at the cost of his individual personality, with each passing campaign reducing his capacity for independent thought and creative problem solving. The political maneuvering within the dynasty intensified as the campaign progressed and resources became stretched across multiple fronts. Junior nobles sought opportunities to demonstrate their competence and gain advancement within the hierarchy, while established overlords worked to protect their territories and command privileges. These internal conflicts occasionally erupted into open warfare between different faction elements, with battles fought according to ancient dueling codes that predated the biotransference process. Overlord Zarek's management of the dynasty's Khatan Shard entities required constant vigilance to prevent these star god fragments from breaking free of their containment systems. The shards retained fragments of their original godlike power and intelligence, making them valuable weapons, but also existential threats to the dynasty itself. Zarek's role involved not just tactical deployment of these entities, but also the continuous maintenance of the complex binding rituals that kept them under Necron control. The Deceiver Shard proved particularly difficult to manage due to its inherent nature as a master of lies and manipulation. Its ability to assume any appearance and perfectly mimic the behavior patterns of other beings made it valuable for infiltration operations, but also created constant uncertainty about its true loyalties and intentions. Zarek developed elaborate verification protocols to ensure that the entity he believed he was commanding was actually the deceiver rather than one of its countless deceptions. The dynasty's relationship with lesser noble houses created additional layers of political complexity that affected military operations throughout the campaign. These houses maintained their own tomb complexes and military forces, but their awakening schedules and strategic priorities did not always align with the Maynarkh Dynasty's immediate needs. Negotiations between different noble factions often resembled diplomatic conferences more than military planning sessions, with elaborate protocols governing precedence and resource allocation. The integration of newly awakened tomb complexes into the dynasty's command structure required careful management to prevent conflicts between different awakening schedules and territorial claims. Some complexes had suffered damage during the Great Sleep that affected their command hierarchies, creating power vacuums that ambitious nobles sought to exploit. These internal struggles diverted resources and attention from the war against Imperial forces, creating opportunities that experienced commanders like Hack learned to recognize and exploit. The Forge worlds of the Orpheus Sector represented the industrial heart of Imperial resistance against the Maynarkh Dynasty's expansion. These mechanized planets, with their towering manufactorums and plasma-fed forges, produced not only the standard weapons and equipment that sustained the Imperial war effort, but also specialized anti-Xenos weaponry, developed specifically to counter Necron technological advantages. The siege of these critical installations became the defining phase of the Orphean War, as both sides recognized that control of the sector's industrial capacity would ultimately determine the conflict's outcome. Forge World Metallica Secundus stood as the sector's primary shipbuilding facility, its orbital rings containing construction bays capable of producing everything from escort vessels to battle cruiser components. The world's surface bristled with defense laser batteries and void shield generators that had been continuously upgraded since the first Necron attacks began. Massive conveyor systems transported raw materials from deep mining operations to processing plants that operated around the clock, their output feeding the insatiable demands of Imperial Navy construction schedules that had been accelerated in response to the growing Xenos threat. The Forge world's Adeptus Mechanicus population included some of the sector's most experienced tech adepts and Magos-level personnel, many of whom had devoted decades to studying captured Necron technology. Their workshops contained specialized equipment designed for analyzing Xenos artifacts, including containment systems that could safely isolate devices whose operating principles violated known physical laws. These research facilities had produced several breakthrough discoveries regarding Necron self-repair mechanisms and energy distribution systems, leading to the development of new ammunition types and defensive countermeasures. Skitarii legions stationed on Metallica Secundus represented the Forge world's primary military force, their augmented bodies and standardized equipment making them ideally suited for the methodical warfare that characterized anti-Necron operations. The Skitarii Vanguard formations carried radium carbines, whose radiation-enhanced projectiles proved particularly effective against Necron warriors, while Ranger units provided long-range fire support with galvanic rifles that could maintain accurate fire even against enemies capable of limited teleportation. Their enhanced sensory systems allowed them to track Necron movements more effectively than baseline human soldiers, though the aliens' phase capabilities still presented significant targeting challenges. The Forge World's Titan maniples included 2 full squadrons of Warhound-class scouts and a single Reaver-class battle Titan designated Ferrum Mortis. These god machines had been modified with experimental weapon systems developed specifically for engaging Necron-heavy constructs, including plasma destructors that generated sustained energy beams capable of overwhelming even advanced self-repair systems. The Titan's void shields had been recalibrated to provide protection against Gauss weapons and particle beams, though their effectiveness varied significantly depending on the specific Necron weapon types encountered. The initial Necron assault on Metallica Secundus began with the activation of dolmen gates that had remained hidden beneath the Forge World's industrial complexes for millions of years. These massive stone archways emerged through factory floors and assembly lines with grinding mechanical precision, their appearance causing catastrophic structural damage to surrounding facilities. The gate's activation created localized gravitational anomalies that pulled entire manufacturing sections into dimensional vortices, while their emergence points became beachheads for Necron forces teleporting directly into the Forge World's most critical production areas. Necron wraiths phased through the Forge World's defensive barriers with contemptuous ease, their serpentine forms moving through solid metal and reinforced ceramite as if these materials were empty air. These constructs targeted the Forge World's most vulnerable systems, including power distribution networks and atmospheric processors that maintain the artificial environment necessary for human habitation. Their dimensional destabilizers could disrupt molecular bonds in critical infrastructure components, causing cascade failures that spread throughout interconnected systems. The Wraith's attacks on power generation facilities created rolling blackouts that affected entire industrial sectors simultaneously. Plasma reactors designed to operate for centuries without maintenance began experiencing containment failures as their control systems were systematically sabotaged. The resulting explosions created secondary damage that spread far beyond the initial attack sites, with radioactive contamination forcing the evacuation of vast areas that had previously been considered secure. Destroyer formations emerged from the dolmen gates with mechanical precision, their anti-gravity platforms allowing them to strike at targets throughout the Forge World's 3-dimensional industrial landscape. These ancient Necrons had been driven mad by their obsession with eliminating all life, but their programming retained enough tactical coherence to make them effective weapons of mass destruction. Their Gauss cannons fired streams of energy that could strip molecular bonds from any material, reducing Imperial vehicles and fortifications to clouds of constituent atoms. The destroyers' targeting priorities focused on eliminating organic personnel rather than simply destroying infrastructure, reflecting their programmed hatred of all biological life. They pursued fleeing tech adepts and servitors through maintenance corridors and service tunnels, their sensors capable of detecting life signs through meters of solid metal. The psychological impact of facing enemies whose sole purpose was the extinction of all living beings created panic among the Forge World's human population, undermining defensive coordination and causing mass evacuations that interfered with military operations. Heavy destroyers provided fire support for the assault forces, their enlarged weapon systems capable of engaging Imperial armor and fortifications at extreme ranges. These constructs positioned themselves on elevated platforms and tower tops throughout the industrial complex, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement extremely hazardous for Imperial forces. Their enhanced targeting systems could track multiple targets simultaneously while calculating firing solutions, that accounted for the complex three-dimensional environment of the Forge world's industrial landscape. The Adeptus Mechanicus response to the Necron assault involved the immediate activation of all available defensive protocols, including the deployment of battle servitor cohorts and the recall of Skitarii forces from patrol duties throughout the system. Tech Dominus Castrius Vex coordinated the defense from the Forge world's primary command center, his multiple mechadendrite appendages interfacing directly with the facility's tactical networks to provide real-time coordination of defensive assets across multiple engagement zones. Vex's analysis of the Necron attack patterns revealed sophisticated coordination between different unit types that suggested central command authority rather than autonomous operation. The timing of Wraith infiltration attacks coincided perfectly with destroyer bombardments, creating maximum disruption while preventing Imperial forces from mounting effective counterattacks. This level of tactical integration indicated that the Necron forces were operating under unified command despite their apparent dispersion across the Forge world's vast industrial complex. The deployment of specialized anti-Xenos weaponry began with the activation of experimental plasma weapons that had been developed through analysis of captured Necron technology. These devices generated sustained energy beams that could maintain molecular disruption, effects long enough to overwhelm self-repair systems, though their power requirements limited their deployment to fixed defensive positions connected to major power sources. Tech adepts operating these weapons required extensive augmentation to interface with control systems that operated according to principles derived from Xenos technology. Electromagnetic pulse generators deployed throughout the Forge world's critical facilities proved effective at disrupting Necron coordination systems, though their range limitations required careful positioning to maximize coverage without creating gaps in defensive coverage. These devices operated by generating specific frequency patterns that interfered with the quantum coherence fields that enabled Necron's self-repair and teleportation capabilities. However, more advanced Necron constructs possessed shielding systems that rendered them immune to electromagnetic interference, limiting the weapon's effectiveness against priority targets. The Skitarii response to the Necron assault demonstrated the effectiveness of their augmented capabilities when properly coordinated with supporting assets. Vanguard formations used their enhanced mobility to conduct hit and run attacks against isolated Necron units, while Ranger squads provided overwatch fire from elevated positions throughout the industrial complex. Their radium weapons proved particularly effective against Necron warriors, whose self-repair systems struggled to cope with radiation-induced molecular damage. Sicarian infiltrators deployed throughout the Forge world's maintenance systems conducted sabotage operations against Necron equipment and supply lines, though their effectiveness was limited by the aliens' lack of conventional logistics requirements. These specialized troops used their stealth capabilities to gather intelligence about Necron deployment patterns and command structures, providing valuable tactical information that allowed Imperial forces to predict and counter enemy movements. The coordination between Skitarii forces and Titan maniples required careful planning to prevent friendly fire incidents while maximizing the effectiveness of combined arms operations. Warhound scouts used their speed and maneuverability to engage Necron heavy constructs, while Skitarii formations provided screening forces and dealt with lighter enemy units. The Titans' enhanced sensors could track Necron movements through the complex industrial environment, providing targeting data for both their own weapons and supporting artillery units. Ferrum Mortis engaged multiple Necron heavy destroyers in a running battle that lasted several hours and caused extensive damage to the Forge world's primary manufacturing district. The Reaver's plasma destructor proved capable of completely destroying Necron constructs with direct hits, but the aliens' mobility and phase capabilities made sustained target acquisition extremely difficult. The Titan's void shields provided protection against most Necron weapons, though concentrated fire from multiple heavy destroyers could overwhelm even these advanced defensive systems. The technological warfare escalation began when Imperial forces deployed experimental weapon systems that incorporated principles derived from captured Necron technology. These hybrid devices combined Imperial manufacturing techniques with Xenos operating principles, creating weapons that could match some aspects of Necron performance while remaining compatible with existing Imperial tactical doctrines. However, their deployment required extensive testing and calibration procedures that limited their battlefield availability. Gravitational manipulation weapons developed by Forge World Lucius proved capable of disrupting Necron teleportation systems by creating localized space-time distortions that interfered with dimensional transit calculations. These devices required massive power sources and specialized targeting systems, limiting their deployment to fixed defensive positions, but their effectiveness against Necron mobility advantages made them valuable strategic assets. The weapon's operation created visible distortions in local space that made conventional targeting extremely difficult for both sides. Quantum disruption field generators created areas of localized reality instability that prevented Necron phase technology from functioning properly. These experimental devices operated by generating controlled quantum fluctuations that interfered with the dimensional manipulation systems that allowed Necrons to pass through solid matter. However, the fields also affected Imperial equipment that relied on advanced technological systems, creating tactical complications that required careful coordination to avoid friendly fire incidents. The Necron response to Imperial technological innovations involved the deployment of increasingly exotic weapon systems that had remained dormant in tomb ship arsenals for millions of years. Particle whips capable of stripping electrons from atomic nuclei created localized areas of molecular instability that could destroy any material regardless of its composition or protective systems. These weapons required precise targeting to avoid collateral damage to valuable infrastructure, but their effectiveness against Imperial fortifications was absolute. Transdimensional beamers transported targeted objects into pocket dimensions, where they were subjected to hostile environmental conditions before being returned to normal space as clouds of superheated plasma. These weapons proved particularly effective against Imperial armor, as their effects bypassed conventional defensive systems entirely. However, their complex targeting requirements and significant power consumption limited their rate of fire and tactical flexibility. Gauss pylons emerged from concealed positions throughout the Forge World's industrial complex, their massive energy projectors capable of creating sustained molecular disruption fields that could strip away entire building sections. These installations drew power directly from the planet's core through gravitational manipulation systems, making them virtually impossible to disable through conventional means. Their placement had been planned millions of years in advance, with optimal firing positions calculated to provide maximum coverage of critical industrial areas. The battle for control of the Forge World's primary manufactorum complex became a grinding war of attrition as both sides deployed increasingly sophisticated weapons and tactics. Imperial forces used their knowledge of the facility's layout to establish defensive positions in areas that provided protection from Necron-heavy weapons, while the aliens exploited their phase capabilities to bypass these positions and attack from unexpected directions. The complex's three-dimensional structure created a maze of potential firing positions and approach routes that made tactical planning extremely challenging for both commanders. Necron viral scrapcode attacks began targeting the Forge World's machine spirits and automated systems, attempting to corrupt their programming through quantum data streams that operated according to non-human logic patterns. These attacks proved particularly devastating against servitors and automated manufacturing equipment, whose simple programming made them vulnerable to external manipulation. Infected systems began producing defective equipment and following contradictory commands, creating chaos throughout the Forge World's production networks. The Adeptus Mechanicus countermeasures against scrapcode infiltration involved the implementation of quantum firewalls and isolation protocols that could contain infected systems while preventing the spread of corruption to critical infrastructure. Tech priests with specialized training in information warfare conducted digital exorcisms on compromised machine spirits, using sacred algorithms and blessed code prayers to purge Xeno's influence from Imperial systems. However, the sophisticated nature of Necron scrap code made complete cleansing extremely difficult, with some systems requiring complete replacement rather than repair. The deployment of Canoptech constructs throughout the Forge world's industrial areas created additional challenges for Imperial forces attempting to maintain control of critical facilities. These spider-like machines could repair damaged Necron equipment while simultaneously sabotaging Imperial infrastructure, their small size and advanced stealth capabilities making them extremely difficult to detect and eliminate. Scarab swarms stripped useful materials from Imperial equipment to support Necron construction projects, while spiders established automated manufacturing facilities that could produce replacement parts and ammunition for Necron forces. The battle's intensity continued to escalate as both sides committed additional resources to securing control of the Forge world's industrial capacity. The outcome would determine not only the fate of Metallica Secundus, but also the broader strategic balance throughout the Orpheus Sector, as the facility's production capabilities were essential to sustaining Imperial resistance against the expanding Necron threat. The prolonged warfare across the Orpheus Sector created opportunities that chaos cults had been waiting centuries to exploit. As Imperial forces concentrated their efforts on combating the Necron threat, the vigilance that normally kept heretical movements in check began to waver. Planetary defense forces found their ranks depleted by transfers to frontline units, while Arbites precincts struggled to maintain order as their personnel were reassigned to military support roles. In this environment of reduced oversight and mounting desperation, followers of the ruinous powers emerged from the shadows to pursue their own dark agendas. The cults of Tzeentch proved particularly drawn to the ancient technologies being unearthed across the sector. The Changer of Ways had always favored those who sought forbidden knowledge, and the Necron artifacts emerging from tomb complexes represented the ultimate prize for scholars willing to risk their souls for understanding. Tech adepts working in xenoarchaeological facilities found themselves approached by seemingly legitimate researchers who offered alternative interpretations of Necron technology that incorporated demonic principles and warp-based energy manipulation. Mago's Explorator Threnex Gamma's original research teams had included several individuals whose curiosity about alien technology exceeded their loyalty to the Omnissiah's teachings. These tech adepts had spent decades studying Necron artifacts in isolation, their minds gradually corrupted by exposure to technologies that operated according to principles that contradicted everything they had been taught about the nature of reality. When the dynasty's awakening began activating dormant systems across the sector, these corrupted individuals saw opportunities to advance their understanding through direct experimentation with active Xenos technology. The cult of the Ninefold Path established itself within the research facilities on Lucius Minor, using the Forge world's focus on xenotech analysis as cover for their heretical activities. Their leader, a former tech priest named Vox Terminus 9, had been among the first Imperial personnel to study active Necron technology when tomb complexes began awakening. His exposure to alien thought patterns had gradually eroded his sanity, while expanding his understanding of technologies that incorporated both mechanical and psychic principles. Vox Terminus 9's followers included tech adepts from multiple Forge worlds who had been drawn together by their shared fascination with the intersection between Necron technology and warp-based phenomena. Their research had revealed that some Necron devices incorporated materials that existed partially within the Immaterium, allowing them to draw power from psychic energy while maintaining their mechanical functionality. This discovery opened possibilities for creating hybrid technologies that combine the reliability of Imperial engineering with the unlimited potential of warp manipulation. The cult's activities remained hidden from Imperial authorities through careful compartmentalization and the use of legitimate research projects as cover for their heretical experiments. Members continued their assigned duties while conducting unauthorized investigations during off-shift periods, using their access to restricted facilities to examine artifacts that had been classified beyond normal security clearance levels. Their work progressed slowly but steadily, with each breakthrough providing new insights into the fundamental nature of reality itself. The psychological toll of constant warfare against a seemingly unstoppable enemy began manifesting in disturbing ways throughout the Imperial civilian population. Agricultural workers on agri-worlds reported increasing numbers of suicides among their colleagues, while industrial workers in hive cities formed informal groups dedicated to discussing the futility of resistance against technologically superior enemies. These gatherings initially served as support networks for individuals struggling with war-related stress, but they gradually evolved into something more sinister as despair gave way to fatalistic acceptance. The cult of the final hour emerged from these informal gatherings. Its doctrine centered on the belief that humanity's destruction was inevitable and that embracing death was preferable to prolonged suffering. The cult's teachings incorporated elements of Imperial theology twisted to support their nihilistic worldview, with emperor worship reinterpreted as preparation for the final judgment that would end human civilization. Their rituals involved meditation on death and the systematic abandonment of hope, practices that initially appeared harmless but gradually eroded the participants' will to resist any form of external threat. Hive Primus on Orpheus Prime became a center of cult activity as its massive population struggled with the psychological impact of living under constant threat of Necron attack. The Hive's lower levels, already overcrowded and poorly monitored by Imperial authorities, provided ideal conditions for heretical movements to spread through the population. Workers who had witnessed the conversion of their colleagues into mechanical abominations found solace in death cult teachings that promised release from the terror of potential capture and biotransference. The cult's influence spread through existing social networks, with family members and work colleagues gradually converting to the death cult's philosophy as traditional Imperial faith proved inadequate to address their psychological needs. Prayer meetings that had once focused on seeking the Emperor's protection began incorporating discussions of death as liberation, while shrine attendance shifted from requests for victory to acceptance of inevitable defeat. These changes occurred gradually enough to avoid immediate detection by Imperial authorities who were focused on more obvious threats. Industrial accidents began occurring with suspicious frequency in facilities where death cult influence had taken hold. Workers operating heavy machinery would suffer fatal accidents that investigation teams attributed to equipment failure or operator error, but the pattern of incidents suggested deliberate self-destruction rather than random misfortune. Production quotas fell as absenteeism increased and worker morale collapsed, creating additional strain on Imperial supply chains that were already stretched by military demands. The warp storms that had begun manifesting throughout the sector created additional complications for Imperial military operations by disrupting communication networks and preventing the arrival of scheduled reinforcements. These psychic disturbances appeared to be connected to the increasing chaos cult activity, as areas with high concentrations of heretical worship experienced more severe warp phenomena than regions that remained loyal to Imperial doctrine. The storm's intensity fluctuated according to patterns that suggested they were being deliberately manipulated rather than occurring as natural phenomena. Astropathic communication between Imperial forces became increasingly unreliable as warp storms interfered with psychic transmissions. Messages that should have taken days to transmit across the sector required weeks to reach their destinations, while some communications disappeared entirely into the roiling chaos of the immaterium. This breakdown in communication networks made coordinated military operations extremely difficult, as commanders found themselves operating without current intelligence about friendly force positions or enemy movements. The storm's effects on Imperial Navy operations proved particularly devastating, as vessels attempting to enter or exit the warp found themselves caught in psychic maelstroms that could destroy ships or transport them to completely different locations. Reinforcement fleets dispatched from neighboring sectors arrived days or weeks behind schedule, if they arrived at all. Several entire battle groups disappeared during warp transit, their fate unknown, but presumed lost to the chaotic energies that increasingly dominated local space. Navigator houses that had served Imperial shipping in the sector for centuries reported unprecedented difficulties in plotting safe warp routes through the growing storms. The psychic turbulence created false readings that led ships off course, while some areas became completely impassable to vessels that lacked the most experienced navigators. Trade routes that had operated reliably for millennia became hazardous passages that only the most desperate or well-equipped merchants would attempt to traverse. The isolation created by warp storm activity had profound effects on Imperial morale throughout the sector. Worlds that had previously maintained regular contact with neighboring systems found themselves cut off from outside support, creating the impression that they were facing the Necron threat alone. This sense of abandonment played directly into Chaos cult recruitment efforts, as desperate populations became more receptive to alternative explanations for their suffering and promises of salvation through heretical means. Imperial commanders found themselves walking an increasingly narrow line between maintaining focus on the Necron threat and preventing Chaos infiltration of their own forces. The psychological strain of fighting enemies that converted captured personnel into mechanical abominations created vulnerabilities that Chaos cults were quick to exploit. Soldiers who had witnessed the fate of captured comrades proved particularly susceptible to death cult recruitment, as their exposure to biotransference horrors made the cult's promises of peaceful death seem preferable to potential capture. Commissars attached to frontline units reported increasing numbers of incidents involving suspected cult activity among Imperial Guard personnel. These ranged from minor infractions, such as possession of heretical literature, to more serious offenses, including the performance of unauthorized rituals and the spread of defeatist propaganda. The traditional response to such incidents involved immediate execution of suspected cultists, but this approach created additional problems when applied to forces already suffering from heavy casualties and low morale. The integration of Space Marine forces into Imperial Guard operations created additional complications, as the Adeptus Astartes' enhanced resistance to Chaos corruption made them valuable assets for identifying and eliminating heretical influence within Imperial ranks. However, their methods often proved too harsh for application to baseline human forces, and their presence sometimes increased tension rather than improving security. Guard officers found themselves caught between the need to maintain unit cohesion and the requirement to eliminate potential threats to Imperial loyalty. Inquisition involvement in anti-cult operations brought additional resources and expertise to bear on the growing heretical threat, but also created jurisdictional conflicts with military commanders who were focused on the immediate Necron danger. Inquisitors operating in the sector possessed broad authority to investigate suspected cult activity, but their methods often disrupted military operations and diverted resources from frontline combat units. The balance between maintaining security and preserving operational effectiveness became an ongoing source of tension within Imperial command structures. The Ordo Xenos found itself particularly challenged by the intersection of Necron and Chaos threats, as their expertise in combating alien influences proved less applicable to heretical movements that drew inspiration from Xenos technology. The cult activities surrounding Necron artifacts required investigation techniques that combined xenological analysis with traditional anti-heresy methods, creating new challenges for inquisitors who were accustomed to dealing with threats that fell clearly into established categories. Purge operations conducted against suspected cult cells required careful coordination to avoid disrupting critical military operations while ensuring complete elimination of heretical influence. These missions often involved the temporary removal of personnel from frontline units for interrogation and potential execution, creating gaps in military formations that had to be filled by already overextended reserves. The psychological impact of watching colleagues disappear into Inquisition custody added another layer of stress to forces that were already operating at the limits of their endurance. The technological aspects of chaos cult activity proved particularly difficult to counter, as heretical researchers had developed techniques for hiding their activities within legitimate Imperial operations. Corrupted tech adepts used their access to restricted facilities to conduct unauthorized experiments while maintaining the appearance of normal research activities. Their work often produced results that appeared beneficial to Imperial interests, making it difficult for security personnel to identify which projects had been compromised by heretical influence. Detection of scrapcode infiltration became increasingly challenging as chaos-corrupted systems learned to mimic normal Imperial programming while pursuing hidden agendas. Machine spirits that had been tainted by exposure to heretical influences would continue performing their assigned functions while secretly gathering intelligence or sabotaging critical systems. The subtle nature of this corruption made it extremely difficult to identify without specialized equipment and expertise that were in short supply throughout the sector. The warp storm's interference with Imperial reinforcement schedules created cascading effects throughout the sector's defensive planning. Military operations that had been designed around the assumption of regular resupply and personnel replacement found themselves operating with increasingly inadequate resources. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled as supply convoys failed to arrive on schedule, while medical supplies ran short as casualty rates exceeded replacement capacity. The breakdown in communication with Terra created additional psychological pressure on Imperial forces who had grown accustomed to receiving strategic guidance and spiritual support from the Imperium's central authorities. Local commanders found themselves making decisions that would normally require approval from higher levels of the Imperial hierarchy, while chaplains and commissars struggled to maintain morale without access to updated doctrinal guidance from their respective organizations. The cumulative effect of these pressures created an environment where chaos corruption could spread rapidly through Imperial ranks despite the best efforts of security personnel to maintain loyalty and discipline. The combination of technological temptation, psychological trauma, and spiritual isolation provided ideal conditions for heretical movements to recruit new followers and expand their influence throughout the sector's Imperial forces. The prolonged nature of the Orphean War forced both Imperial and Necron forces to continuously evolve their tactical approaches as each side adapted to counter the other's innovations. What had begun as a conventional Imperial response to Xeno's incursion gradually transformed into a sophisticated campaign of technological warfare, where scientific advancement became as critical as battlefield prowess. The Adeptus Mechanicus Forge worlds found themselves at the center of this evolution, their research facilities working around the clock to develop new weapons and countermeasures, while Necron cryptechs responded with increasingly exotic technologies drawn from their vast archives of pre-war in-heaven knowledge. The Imperial development of specialized anti-Necron tactics began with the systematic analysis of battlefield recordings from early engagements. Tech adepts studying picked captures from the disaster at mining complex Tertius identified specific patterns in Necron self-repair sequences that suggested vulnerabilities in their quantum coherence fields. These observations led to the development of electromagnetic pulse weaponry specifically calibrated to disrupt the frequency ranges that Necron technology used for internal communication and repair coordination. The first generation of these weapons proved crude but effective, consisting of modified Vox casters that could generate powerful electromagnetic bursts at close range. The refinement of EMP technology required extensive collaboration between multiple Forge worlds, each contributing specialized knowledge about electromagnetic theory and practical weapon design. Forge World Metallica Secundus developed the targeting systems that could identify and lock onto the specific quantum signatures emitted by active Necron equipment, while Lucius Minor contributed the power generation technology needed to produce electromagnetic pulses of sufficient intensity to overwhelm alien defensive systems. The resulting weapons incorporated focusing arrays that could concentrate electromagnetic energy into narrow beams capable of disrupting Necron systems at ranges exceeding 200 meters. Field testing of electromagnetic pulse weapons revealed both their potential and their limitations when deployed against different types of Necron forces. Warriors and Immortals proved highly susceptible to EMP attacks, their relatively simple construction making them vulnerable to electromagnetic interference that could disrupt their motor functions and weapon systems for several minutes. However, more advanced constructs such as Lichguard and Triarch Praetorians possessed sophisticated shielding systems that rendered them largely immune to electromagnetic disruption. The weapons proved most effective when used in coordinated volleys that could disable multiple enemy units simultaneously, creating temporary gaps in Necron formations that Imperial forces could exploit through rapid assault tactics. The integration of EMP weapons into existing Imperial tactical doctrine required significant modifications to standard operating procedures. Infantry squads equipped with electromagnetic pulse generators needed to coordinate their attacks carefully to avoid interfering with their own equipment, as the weapon's effects could disrupt Imperial Vox communications and targeting systems if used improperly. Heavy weapons teams learned to time their EMP attacks to coincide with artillery bombardments, using the electromagnetic disruption to prevent Necron forces from teleporting away from impact zones, while conventional weapons inflicted maximum damage on temporarily disabled targets. Coordinated artillery bombardments evolved from simple suppression fire into precisely timed operations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Necron defensive capabilities. Imperial artillery crews discovered that Necron forces relied heavily on quantum entanglement networks for tactical coordination, with individual units receiving targeting data and movement orders through subspace communication channels that operated faster than light. Disrupting these networks through carefully planned electromagnetic interference could create windows of vulnerability during which Necron forces became significantly less effective at coordinating their responses to Imperial attacks. The development of specialized artillery shells incorporated lessons learned from studying captured Necron technology. Standard high-explosive rounds proved largely ineffective against Necron warriors due to their self-repair capabilities, but shells designed to create sustained electromagnetic fields could prevent damaged units from repairing themselves long enough for follow-up attacks to achieve complete destruction. These specialized munitions required exotic materials that were expensive to produce and difficult to transport, limiting their availability to critical operations where their effectiveness justified their cost. Artillery targeting procedures adapted to account for Necron teleportation capabilities through the implementation of predictive firing patterns that anticipated enemy movement rather than simply targeting current positions. Imperial gunners learned to calculate probable teleportation destinations based on tactical analysis of Necron movement patterns, allowing them to place artillery strikes in locations where enemy forces were likely to appear rather than where they currently stood. This approach required extensive coordination between artillery units and forward observers who could provide real-time intelligence about Necron tactical behavior. The Necron response to Imperial electromagnetic warfare demonstrated the dynasty's capacity for rapid tactical evolution under pressure. Cryptechs attached to frontline units began deploying quantum shielding systems that could protect entire formations from electromagnetic interference while maintaining their ability to coordinate through entanglement networks. These defensive measures incorporated principles of dimensional manipulation that created localized reality distortions around Necron forces, causing electromagnetic pulses to phase through their targets without affecting the underlying quantum systems. Overlord Kutlak's specialization in psychological warfare led to significant changes in how the Maynarkh Dynasty deployed their Flayed One populations. Rather than simply releasing these afflicted Necrons to pursue their obsessions randomly, Kutlak developed sophisticated command protocols that could direct their activities towards specific psychological objectives. Flayed Ones began appearing in Imperial rear areas, where their presence would create maximum terror among support personnel, while their attacks on forward positions were timed to coincide with conventional assaults to maximize their disruptive effect on Imperial morale. The systematic use of Flayed Ones as psychological weapons required careful management to prevent their madness from interfering with broader tactical objectives. Kutlak's command protocols incorporated behavioral conditioning techniques that channeled the creature's bloodlust toward designated target categories, while maintaining enough control to prevent them from attacking valuable prisoners or interfering with Necron technical operations. These modified Flayed Ones retained their terrifying appearance and savage combat capabilities, while becoming more tactically useful than their uncontrolled counterparts. Imperial forces began encountering Flayed One packs that demonstrated unprecedented levels of coordination and tactical awareness. These creatures would establish ambush positions along Imperial supply routes and maintain them for days without moving, waiting for specific target types to enter their engagement zones. Their attacks followed patterns that suggested central coordination rather than random predatory behavior, with multiple packs striking simultaneously across wide geographic areas to create maximum disruption of Imperial logistics networks. The psychological impact of facing coordinated Flayed One attacks proved more devastating than their previous random appearances. Imperial troops who had learned to cope with the possibility of encountering individual mad Necrons found themselves unprepared for organized terror campaigns that seemed to anticipate their movements and exploit their psychological vulnerabilities. Medical facilities reported increasing numbers of personnel suffering from combat stress reactions that exceeded normal parameters for battlefield trauma, with symptoms that suggested exposure to deliberately designed psychological warfare rather than conventional combat experiences. Lychguard formations began appearing in Necron battle lines with increasing frequency as the dynasty adapted to Imperial electromagnetic warfare capabilities. These elite bodyguards possessed sophisticated defensive systems that rendered them immune to most forms of Imperial electronic warfare, while their warscythes could cleave through even the heaviest Imperial armor with contemptuous ease. Their deployment in coordinated formations created anchor points around which other Necron forces could rally, providing stability that allowed the dynasty to maintain tactical coherence even when their communications networks were disrupted. The tactical employment of Lychguard units demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Imperial weaknesses and battlefield psychology. These elite warriors would advance at the front of Necron formations, their imposing presence and obvious invulnerability to Imperial weapons creating psychological pressure that often broke enemy morale before physical contact occurred. Their hyperphase swords could slice through power armor and vehicle hulls with equal ease, while their dispersion shields provided protection against Imperial heavy weapons that made them nearly impossible to eliminate through conventional fire support. Imperial forces attempting to engage Lychguard formations discovered that standard anti-armor tactics proved ineffective against enemies whose equipment operated according to principles that transcended normal physical limitations. Meltaguns and plasma weapons that could destroy Imperial tanks failed to penetrate dispersion shields that redirected energy attacks into parallel dimensions. Las cannons and missile launchers proved equally ineffective. Their projectiles either deflected harmlessly or absorbed by shield systems that seemed to violate conservation of energy principles. The adaptation of Imperial tactics to counter Lychguard formations required the development of new approaches that focused on avoiding direct confrontation rather than attempting to destroy these elite units through conventional means. Imperial commanders learned to use mobility and terrain advantages to bypass Lychguard positions, while targeting less heavily defended Necron units that provided essential support functions. Artillery bombardments were redirected to focus on disrupting Necron coordination systems rather than attempting to destroy individual elite warriors who proved nearly invulnerable to indirect fire. Imperial intelligence operations in the Orpheus Sector underwent significant expansion as commanders recognized the critical importance of understanding Necron capabilities and predicting their strategic intentions. The establishment of specialized xenological analysis teams brought together personnel from the Ordo Xenos, Adeptus Mechanicus, and Imperial Guard intelligence services to create comprehensive assessments of Necron technology and tactical doctrine. These teams operated from secure facilities on Forge worlds, where they could access both captured alien equipment and the technical expertise needed to analyze technologies that operated according to non-human principles. The mapping of Necron tomb complexes became a critical intelligence priority as Imperial forces realized that understanding the aliens' infrastructure was essential for predicting their strategic capabilities. Deep penetration reconnaissance missions conducted by Catachan jungle fighters and Raven Guard scouts provided detailed intelligence about tomb complex layouts and defensive systems, though these operations carried extreme risks due to the aliens' advanced sensor capabilities and automated defense networks. The intelligence gathered from these missions revealed that Necron tomb complexes were far more extensive than initial surveys had suggested, with some installations extending hundreds of kilometers beneath planetary surfaces. Seismic analysis techniques developed by Imperial geologists provided additional methods for mapping underground Necron installations without requiring direct infiltration. Specialized equipment that could detect gravitational anomalies and quantum field fluctuations allowed Imperial forces to identify the locations of major tomb complexes and estimate their probable capacity and strategic importance. These surveys revealed that virtually every world in the Orpheus Sector contained some form of Necron infrastructure, with the most heavily developed installations located beneath Imperial population centers and industrial facilities. The prediction of Necron awakening patterns became possible through analysis of the quantum entanglement networks that connected different tomb complexes across the sector. Imperial tech adepts discovered that these networks operated according to mathematical principles that could be modeled using advanced computational techniques, allowing them to predict which installations were likely to activate next based on observed patterns of energy distribution and communication traffic. This capability provided Imperial commanders with strategic warning about potential Necron operations, though the aliens' ability to alter their activation schedules limited the reliability of long-term predictions. Intelligence analysis of captured Necron equipment revealed the existence of command hierarchies and strategic planning systems that operated on timescales far exceeding human comprehension. Some Necron installations contained strategic databases that included detailed plans for campaigns spanning thousands of years, with contingency protocols that accounted for virtually every possible variation in enemy capabilities and responses. The discovery of these long-term planning systems forced Imperial commanders to recognize that they were fighting an enemy whose strategic thinking operated according to principles completely alien to human military doctrine. The technological arms race between Imperial Forge worlds and Necron cryptechs intensified as both sides deployed increasingly exotic weapons and countermeasures. Mechanicus research teams working with captured alien technology began developing hybrid systems that incorporated Necron operating principles while remaining compatible with Imperial manufacturing capabilities. These experimental weapons pushed the boundaries of what Imperial technology could achieve, often requiring rare materials and specialized manufacturing techniques that limited their production to small numbers of prototype units. Gravitational manipulation weapons developed by Forge World Lucius represented one of the most significant breakthroughs in Imperial anti-Xenos technology. These devices could create localized gravitational fields that disrupted Necron teleportation systems, while simultaneously providing defensive barriers against enemy weapons' fire. The weapons operated by generating controlled singularities that could be shaped and directed through electromagnetic field manipulation, creating effects that ranged from defensive shields to offensive weapons capable of crushing enemy vehicles through gravitational compression. The deployment of gravitational weapons required extensive modifications to Imperial tactical doctrine and support systems. The devices consumed enormous amounts of power and required specialized targeting systems that could calculate gravitational field interactions in real time. Their operation created visible distortions in local space-time that made conventional targeting extremely difficult for both sides, while their effects on nearby Imperial equipment required careful coordination to prevent friendly fire incidents. Necron cryptechs responded to Imperial gravitational weapons through the deployment of reality stabilization fields that could maintain normal space-time conditions within designated areas. These defensive systems incorporated technologies that predated the war in heaven, drawing on the dynasty's most advanced archives of theoretical physics and dimensional manipulation. The stabilization fields created zones where Imperial gravitational weapons became ineffective, while allowing Necron forces to operate normally despite the space-time distortions created by enemy weapons. Quantum disruption technologies developed by both sides created increasingly complex interactions between competing weapon systems and defensive measures. Imperial quantum field generators, designed to disrupt Necron phase capabilities, found themselves countered by alien reality anchors that could maintain stable dimensional conditions regardless of external interference. The resulting technological escalation created battlefield environments where multiple competing physical laws operated simultaneously, with different areas of the same engagement zone experiencing varying degrees of reality stability. Temporal manipulation systems began appearing in Necron arsenals as cryptechs deployed increasingly exotic technologies to counter Imperial adaptations. These devices could create localized time distortions that allowed Necron forces to operate at accelerated temporal rates while their enemies moved at normal speed, providing tactical advantages that proved nearly impossible to counter through conventional means. Imperial forces facing temporal manipulation found their weapons' fire arriving at target locations before they had completed their firing sequences, while their movements appeared sluggish compared to enemies who could complete complex maneuvers in fractions of seconds. The Imperial response to temporal warfare required the development of chronometer-based targeting systems that could predict enemy positions across multiple temporal states simultaneously. These experimental devices incorporated principles derived from navigator warp sight techniques combined with Mechanicus computational systems, creating targeting solutions that accounted for temporal distortions and probability fluctuations. The systems proved effective, but required extensive training for operators who needed to understand concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about cause and effect. Exotic matter weapons appeared in both Imperial and Necron arsenals as the technological escalation continued. Imperial researchers developed ammunition types that incorporated materials existing in quantum superposition states, allowing projectiles to bypass conventional defensive systems by existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Necron cryptechs countered with weapons that fired streams of exotic particles that could disrupt molecular bonds at the subatomic level, creating effects that transcended normal concepts of armor and protection. The battlefield deployment of these advanced technologies created environments that challenged the operational capabilities of conventional military forces. Infantry units equipped with exotic weapons required extensive augmentation to interface with targeting systems that operated according to non-human logic principles. Vehicle crews needed specialized training to operate in combat zones where multiple competing physical laws created unpredictable interactions between different weapon systems and defensive measures. The cumulative effect of this technological evolution transformed the nature of warfare in the Orpheus Sector from conventional military operations into something approaching theoretical physics experiments conducted with lethal intent. Both sides continued developing new weapons and countermeasures at an accelerating pace, with each innovation requiring corresponding adaptations in tactics, training, and support systems. The war had evolved beyond simple territorial conquest into a fundamental contest between competing approaches to understanding and manipulating the basic laws of reality itself. The transformation of imperial fortunes in the Orphean War began with a series of carefully coordinated strikes that demonstrated the effectiveness of the new tactical doctrines developed through months of bitter experience. The Battle of Orpheus Prime's northern continent marked the first major imperial victory against Necron forces, achieved through the systematic application of lessons learned from previous defeats. Lord Commander Hack's forces had spent weeks preparing defensive positions that incorporated specialized anti-Xenos equipment while accounting for Necron teleportation capabilities and phase technology. The northern continent's strategic value lay in its massive agricultural processing facilities and the primary spaceport that served as the sector's main hub for interplanetary commerce. Necron forces had targeted these installations as part of their systematic campaign to disrupt Imperial supply networks, deploying substantial forces, including multiple Overlord-led formations and supporting Canoptech constructs. The aliens' approach followed their established pattern of simultaneous attacks on multiple objectives, designed to overwhelm Imperial defensive capabilities through sheer coordination and technological superiority. Imperial preparations for the battle involved the deployment of gravitational manipulation weapons at key defensive positions around the spaceport and processing facilities. These experimental devices, developed through analysis of captured Necron technology, created localized space-time distortions that interfered with enemy teleportation systems while providing defensive barriers against Gauss weapons and particle beams. The weapons required massive power sources and specialized targeting systems, limiting their deployment to fixed positions connected to the continent's primary power grid. Electromagnetic pulse generators positioned throughout the defensive perimeter provided overlapping fields of interference that could disrupt Necron coordination systems and self-repair mechanisms. These devices operated on frequencies specifically calibrated to interfere with the quantum coherence fields that enabled Necron technology, though their effectiveness varied significantly against different unit types. Warriors and Immortals proved highly susceptible to electromagnetic disruption, while more advanced constructs possessed shielding systems that provided partial or complete immunity. The Mordian Iron Guard's 23rd Regiment anchored the main defensive line with disciplined firing positions that maximized their law's weapon effectiveness against disrupted Necron forces. Their officers had trained extensively in the coordination of electromagnetic pulse attacks with conventional weapons fire, timing their volleys to exploit the brief windows when enemy self-repair systems remained offline. Heavy weapons teams equipped with plasma cannons and las cannons provided concentrated firepower capable of achieving the complete destruction necessary to prevent Necron regeneration. Catachan jungle fighters deployed throughout the continent's extensive forest networks conducted harassment operations against Necron supply lines and isolated patrol units. Their unconventional tactics proved highly effective against enemies who expected more predictable Imperial responses, using improvised explosives and sabotage techniques to disrupt Canoptech construction operations and eliminate Tomb Spider units before they could establish forward repair facilities. The Catachan's ability to operate independently of conventional supply lines allowed them to maintain pressure on Necron forces even when primary Imperial formations were engaged in major battles. The Ultramarines' Second Company provided rapid response capabilities that could exploit tactical opportunities created by successful electromagnetic pulse attacks. Captain Ventress had developed specialized assault tactics that focused on achieving complete destruction of disabled Necron units before their self-repair systems could reactivate. His tactical squads carried specialized ammunition types, including Kraken penetrator rounds and Hellfire shells, designed to cause maximum structural damage to mechanical targets. Necron forces approaching the northern continent included elements from multiple tomb complexes, operating under unified command from Overlord Kutlak. The aliens deployed substantial numbers of flayed ones, alongside conventional warrior formations, using the afflicted Necrons' terror capabilities to disrupt Imperial morale, while their coordinated attacks created gaps in defensive lines. Wraith formations provided infiltration capabilities that could bypass electromagnetic barriers through dimensional phasing, while destroyer squadrons offered mobile heavy weapons support. The battle's opening phase demonstrated the effectiveness of Imperial countermeasures when properly coordinated with conventional tactics. Necron forces attempting to teleport directly into Imperial positions found themselves materializing within gravitational distortion fields that disrupted their spatial orientation and prevented accurate targeting. Electromagnetic pulse attacks fired simultaneously with artillery bombardments created sustained periods when enemy forces remained vulnerable to conventional weapons, while their technological advantages were temporarily neutralized. Imperial artillery crews had adapted their firing procedures to account for Necron mobility and self-repair capabilities through the development of predictive targeting techniques. Rather than simply bombarding current enemy positions, gunners calculated probable teleportation destinations based on tactical analysis of alien movement patterns. This approach allowed them to place artillery strikes in locations where Necron forces were likely to appear rather than where they currently stood, achieving significantly higher hit rates against highly mobile targets. The coordination between different Imperial force types reached unprecedented levels of effectiveness during the Northern Continent battle. Space Marine assault squads would advance immediately following electromagnetic pulse attacks, using their superior mobility and firepower to eliminate disabled Necron units before enemy coordination could be reestablished. Imperial Guard formations provided sustained fire support and held defensive positions, while specialized anti-Xenos teams deployed exotic weapons against priority targets that conventional forces could not engage effectively. Necron attempts to counter Imperial electromagnetic warfare through the deployment of quantum shielding systems proved only partially successful. While these defensive measures protected advanced constructs like Lich Guard and Triarch Praetorians from electromagnetic interference, they required substantial power resources that limited their deployment to critical units. Basic warriors and immortals remained vulnerable to pulse attacks, creating tactical vulnerabilities that Imperial forces learned to exploit through coordinated combined arms operations. The successful defense of the sector capital's main spaceport represented another crucial Imperial victory that demonstrated the growing effectiveness of anti-Necron tactical doctrine. The facility's strategic importance extended beyond its role in civilian commerce to encompass its function as the primary hub for military logistics throughout the sector. Necron forces had targeted the spaceport as part of their campaign to isolate Imperial worlds from external reinforcement and resupply, deploying substantial forces, including tomb ship support and specialized siege equipment. Imperial defensive preparations at the spaceport incorporated lessons learned from previous facility defense operations, with particular attention to preventing Necron infiltration through underground tunnel systems and maintenance networks. Seismic monitoring equipment detected approaching tomb complexes and dolmen gate activations, providing early warning that allowed defensive forces to prepare countermeasures before enemy attacks materialized. Specialized scanning arrays could identify quantum field fluctuations associated with Necron phase technology, alerting security teams to potential infiltration attempts. The Steel Legion's 15th Armored Regiment provided mobile defense capabilities that could respond rapidly to Necron attacks across the spaceport's extensive facilities. Their Leman Russ battle tanks had been modified with electromagnetic pulse generators, and specialized ammunition types designed for anti-Xenos operations. Chimera transports carried infantry squads equipped with plasma weapons and melta-guns capable of achieving the complete destruction necessary to prevent Necron self-repair processes. Adeptus Mechanicus battle servitor cohorts stationed throughout the spaceport complex provided automated defense capabilities that could operate independently of human command authority. These cybernetic constructs had been programmed with tactical protocols specifically designed for engaging Necron forces, including target prioritization systems that focused fire on units whose destruction would maximize disruption of enemy coordination networks. Their integrated weapon systems included plasma cannons and conversion beamers capable of destroying even heavily armored Necron constructs. The discovery and systematic exploitation of Necron command protocols represented perhaps the most significant intelligence breakthrough of the entire campaign. Tech Priest Dominus Vex's research teams had spent months analyzing captured Necron communication equipment and command interface systems, gradually developing techniques for intercepting and decoding the quantum encrypted signals that coordinated Dynasty military operations. This work required unprecedented cooperation between captured Imperial personnel who had been exposed to Necron technology and Adeptus Mechanicus specialists with expertise in xenotech analysis. Tech Marines from multiple Space Marine chapters contributed their expertise in both Imperial and alien technology systems to the Command Protocol Analysis Project. Their enhanced cognitive capabilities and direct neural interfaces with machine systems allowed them to process alien data streams that would have overwhelmed baseline human consciousness. Brother Sergeant Maltheus of the Iron Hands proved particularly valuable due to his chapter's extensive experience with cybernetic enhancement and machine spirit communion techniques. The breakthrough came when analysis teams discovered that Necron command protocols incorporated redundant authorization codes that could be exploited to introduce false instructions into Dynasty communication networks. These security features had been designed to prevent command system corruption during the biotransference process millions of years earlier, but their implementation created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sufficiently sophisticated interference techniques. Imperial forces could inject contradictory orders into Necron tactical networks, creating confusion and coordination failures that significantly degraded enemy operational effectiveness. The practical application of command protocol disruption required the development of specialized transmission equipment capable of generating quantum encrypted signals that matched Necron communication standards. This technology incorporated principles derived from captured alien equipment combined with Imperial engineering techniques, creating hybrid systems that could interface with Necron networks while remaining compatible with Imperial tactical doctrine. The resulting devices required extensive power sources and specialized operators trained in both Imperial and alien communication protocols. Field testing of command protocol disruption techniques during the spaceport defense demonstrated their potential for creating tactical advantages that could offset Necron technological superiority. Imperial forces could cause enemy formations to receive conflicting movement orders, resulting in units teleporting to incorrect positions or failing to coordinate their attacks effectively. More sophisticated interference could trigger false priority alerts that caused Necron forces to abandon current objectives in favor of responding to non-existent threats in different operational areas. The systematic Imperial withdrawal from Outer Rim worlds represented a strategic decision that acknowledged the impossibility of defending every installation against Necron attacks while maintaining effective resistance at critical locations. Lord Commander Hack's analysis of Imperial defensive capabilities concluded that dispersed deployments played to enemy strengths by allowing Necron forces to concentrate overwhelming technological advantages against isolated garrison units. Consolidating defenses around core industrial and population centers would create opportunities for the coordinated application of Imperial numerical advantages and specialized anti-Xenos equipment. The withdrawal operations required careful planning to prevent Necron forces from exploiting Imperial movement to achieve strategic objectives through pursuit and harassment attacks. Imperial Navy assets provided orbital fire support and transportation capabilities that allowed garrison forces to evacuate critical personnel and equipment while denying useful materials to advancing enemy forces. Demolition teams systematically destroyed infrastructure that could support Necron operations, including power generation facilities and communication networks. Mining installations throughout the sector's outer systems underwent controlled destruction rather than abandonment to prevent Necron forces from accessing rare materials and manufacturing equipment. Specialized demolition charges developed by Imperial engineers could destroy even heavily reinforced industrial facilities while creating debris fields that would impede enemy salvage operations. These operations required precise timing to ensure complete destruction while allowing Imperial personnel sufficient time to evacuate safely. Agricultural worlds on the sector's periphery presented particular challenges for withdrawal operations due to their extensive civilian populations and critical food production capabilities. Imperial authorities implemented emergency evacuation protocols that prioritized essential personnel and genetic seed stocks while maintaining production levels as long as possible. Transport ships operated continuous shuttle runs between threatened worlds and secure facilities in the sector's core regions, moving millions of civilians and thousands of tons of critical supplies under constant threat of Necron interdiction. The arrival of significant Space Marine reinforcements marked a crucial turning point in Imperial defensive capabilities throughout the sector. Elements of the Iron Hands chapter brought specialized anti-Xenos equipment developed through their extensive experience fighting technologically superior enemies across the galaxy. Their expertise in cybernetic warfare and machine spirit communion provided valuable capabilities for countering Necron electronic warfare and command system infiltration attempts. Iron Hands Techmarines carried experimental weapon systems that incorporated the chapter's most advanced cybernetic enhancement technologies. These devices included neural interface systems that allowed direct mental control of multiple weapon platforms simultaneously, creating coordination capabilities that approached Necron levels of tactical integration. Servo-Skull networks provided real-time battlefield intelligence and targeting data that could be processed through enhanced cognitive systems faster than conventional human reaction times. The chapter's approach to anti-Xenos warfare emphasized the systematic analysis and exploitation of enemy technological weaknesses rather than relying primarily on superior firepower or tactical coordination. Iron Hands Battle Brothers conducted detailed post-engagement analysis of every encounter with Necron forces, building comprehensive databases of enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities that informed the development of new tactical doctrines and equipment modifications. Specialized anti-Xenos equipment deployed with the Iron Hands reinforcements included gravitational anchor systems that could prevent Necron teleportation within designated areas and quantum disruption fields that interfered with alien self-repair mechanisms. These devices represented the cutting edge of Imperial technology development, incorporating principles derived from captured Xenos equipment while remaining compatible with Space Marine power armor and weapon systems. The integration of Iron Hands capabilities with existing Imperial forces required significant modifications to establish tactical doctrines and command structures. The chapter's emphasis on cybernetic enhancement and direct machine interface created coordination challenges with baseline human forces who lacked the cognitive augmentation necessary to process information at enhanced rates. However, their technological expertise proved invaluable for training other Imperial personnel in the effective employment of anti-Xenos equipment and tactics. The cumulative effect of these developments began shifting the strategic balance throughout the Orpheus Sector as Imperial forces demonstrated increasing effectiveness against Necron tactical advantages. Command protocol disruption reduced enemy coordination capabilities, while specialized weapons and defensive systems provided tools for engaging alien forces on more equal terms. The consolidation of Imperial defenses around critical installations created opportunities for coordinated operations that could achieve local superiority despite overall Necron technological advantages. Necron responses to Imperial tactical evolution demonstrated the dynasty's capacity for strategic adaptation, but also revealed limitations in their ability to counter human innovation and numerical advantages when properly applied. The aliens' reliance on technological superiority became a vulnerability when Imperial forces developed effective countermeasures, while their limited numbers prevented them from maintaining pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously when faced with coordinated resistance. The final phase of the Orphean War descended into a grinding campaign of attrition that consumed entire Imperial Guard regiments with mechanical efficiency. As Necron forces adapted to Imperial countermeasures and began deploying increasingly exotic technologies, the conflict transformed from tactical engagements into prolonged sieges, where victory was measured not in territory gained, but in the rate at which both sides exhausted their strategic reserves. The systematic reclamation of key worlds proceeded at enormous cost, with each facility retaken requiring the complete destruction of Necron defensive positions that had been constructed using technologies that violated fundamental principles of Imperial engineering. The siege of Forge World Lucius Minor exemplified the brutal mathematics of late-war operations. Imperial forces required 3 full months to dislodge Necron defenders from the facility's primary manufactorum complex, during which the Mordian Iron Guard's 15th, 23rd, and 31st regiments were reduced to company strength formations through constant attrition. The Forge World's labyrinthine industrial structures provided Necron forces with countless defensive positions that could only be cleared through room-by-room fighting, with each corridor advance costing dozens of Imperial lives against enemies who felt no fatigue and required no resupply. Necron defensive tactics during these prolonged sieges demonstrated their mastery of positional warfare adapted to industrial environments. Gauss pylons positioned throughout factory complexes created overlapping fields of molecular disruption that could strip flesh from bone at ranges exceeding 500 meters. These installations drew power directly from the Forge World's plasma reactors through gravitational manipulation systems, making them virtually impossible to disable through conventional sabotage techniques. Imperial assault teams attempting to approach pylon positions found themselves advancing through zones where the air itself became lethal, with atmospheric molecules destabilized to the point where breathing became impossible. Canoptech constructs established automated manufacturing facilities within captured Imperial infrastructure, converting production lines designed for creating Imperial equipment into assembly systems that produced Necron warriors and scarab swarms. These converted facilities operated with terrifying efficiency, processing raw materials at rates that exceeded their original Imperial specifications, while producing enemy reinforcements that could immediately enter combat without requiring activation protocols or strategic deployment. Tech Priest reconnaissance teams discovered assembly lines that had been producing Necron warriors continuously for weeks, with each facility capable of generating dozens of new enemy units daily. The psychological toll on Imperial forces during these extended operations created casualty rates that exceeded physical combat losses. Medici personnel reported unprecedented numbers of troops suffering complete psychological breakdown after witnessing the systematic conversion of familiar industrial facilities into alien production centers. Soldiers who had worked in these same factories before the war found themselves fighting through corridors they had once walked daily, now transformed into geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly and filled with the mechanical sounds of Necron manufacturing processes. Commissars attached to besieging forces faced impossible decisions regarding troop morale and combat effectiveness. Traditional methods for maintaining discipline proved inadequate when applied to soldiers who had watched their former workplaces converted into enemy strongholds. Execution for cowardice became counterproductive when applied to troops whose psychological trauma stemmed from exposure to technologies that challenged basic assumptions about reality itself. Several commissars reported to Sector Command that standard Imperial doctrine provided no guidance for maintaining unit cohesion under conditions where the enemy's very presence violated natural law. The Talern Desert Raiders' 7th Armored Regiment suffered complete destruction during the assault on Processing Station Gamma 7, their Leman Russ battle tanks proving inadequate against Necron defensive positions that incorporated reality-distorting technologies. Tank crews reported targeting systems that provided accurate range and bearing data for targets that ceased to exist when fired upon, while their weapons struck empty air despite clear visual confirmation of enemy positions. The regiment's final Vox transmission described enemy fortifications that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, making conventional assault tactics impossible to execute effectively. Imperial casualties during the final phase reached levels that strained the sector's ability to process and document losses accurately. The Administratum's casualty recording systems, designed to handle the statistical requirements of conventional warfare, proved inadequate for tracking losses that included personnel who had been converted into mechanical constructs or subjected to biotransference procedures that left their ultimate fate unclear. Medical personnel struggled to classify injuries caused by weapons that disrupted molecular bonds or created temporal displacement effects that aged victims' decades in seconds. The Vestroyan Firstborn's 12th Regiment disappeared entirely during operations on the industrial world of Kronos, with their last confirmed position being a manufacturing complex that subsequent reconnaissance found to be completely empty of both Imperial and Necron forces. Orbital surveys detected no signs of battle damage or evidence of struggle, leading to speculation that the entire regiment had been subjected to some form of dimensional displacement or temporal manipulation. Search and rescue operations conducted over several weeks found no trace of the missing personnel, their equipment, or any indication of what had occurred within the facility. Astra Militarum Medical Services documented injury patterns that defied conventional understanding of battlefield trauma. Soldiers exposed to Gauss weapon fire suffered wounds that continued deteriorating long after initial treatment, with molecular disruption effects spreading through healthy tissue despite the absence of any detectable pathogen or toxin. Plasma burns from Necron heat rays created injuries that appeared to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, with some patients experiencing healing and deterioration cycles that repeated indefinitely without resolution. The establishment of permanent monitoring stations around confirmed Necron tomb sites became a critical component of Imperial defensive planning as the war's scope became apparent. These installations, constructed using specialized equipment developed through analysis of captured alien technology, incorporated seismic monitoring, arrays capable of detecting underground activity at depths exceeding 10 kilometers. Gravitational sensors tracked mass movements beneath planetary surfaces, while quantum field detectors identified the energy signatures associated with tomb complex activation procedures. Each monitoring station required a permanent garrison of specially trained personnel, equipped with anti-Xenos weapons and communication equipment capable of transmitting warnings across interstellar distances. These facilities operated under strict protocols that prioritized early warning over direct engagement, with standing orders to evacuate immediately upon detecting tomb awakening activity rather than attempting to prevent or delay enemy operations. The psychological strain of manning these isolated outposts created additional personnel requirements, as rotation schedules had to account for the mental health effects of constant vigilance against an enemy that could emerge without warning. Monitoring station personnel reported disturbing patterns of underground activity that suggested Necron tomb complexes remained active even after surface military operations had concluded. Seismic readings indicated ongoing construction and expansion activities beneath worlds that Imperial forces had officially reclaimed, while gravitational anomalies suggested the movement of massive objects through underground tunnel networks that extended across entire continents. These discoveries forced Imperial commanders to acknowledge that their victories had been largely superficial, with enemy forces maintaining substantial capabilities beneath areas under nominal Imperial control. The technical challenges of maintaining monitoring equipment in environments affected by Necron technology required constant adaptation and innovation. Standard Imperial electronics suffered systematic failures when exposed to the quantum field fluctuations generated by active tomb complexes, while communication systems experienced interference patterns that suggested deliberate jamming rather than random electromagnetic noise. Specialized shielding systems developed by the Adeptus Mechanicus provided partial protection for critical equipment, but these measures required rare materials and regular maintenance that strained already overextended supply lines. Sector population levels suffered catastrophic decline during the final phase of the war as civilian casualties mounted and entire planetary populations were subjected to Necron biotransference procedures. Agricultural worlds that had supported billions of inhabitants were reduced to automated farming operations tended by mechanical constructs, while industrial centers became ghost towns populated only by converted human consciousness patterns operating Imperial machinery under alien control. The Administratum's demographic analysis indicated that the sector's total human population had decreased by approximately 60%, with some worlds experiencing complete depopulation. The economic reconstruction challenges facing surviving Imperial worlds extended far beyond simple infrastructure repair to encompass fundamental questions about the safety of continuing human habitation in areas where Necron influence remained active. Industrial facilities that had been reclaimed from enemy control required extensive decontamination procedures to remove technological contamination that could affect Imperial equipment and personnel. Standard purification protocols proved inadequate for dealing with alien technologies that operated according to principles that transcended normal physical limitations. Technological contamination concerns created unprecedented challenges for Imperial technical personnel attempting to restore captured facilities to operational status. Equipment that had been exposed to Necron influence exhibited behavioral anomalies that suggested the presence of alien programming or consciousness patterns embedded within their machine spirits. Manufacturing systems produced components with specifications that deviated from programmed parameters in ways that improved performance but violated Imperial technical doctrine. Quality control procedures detected modifications to production processes that had been implemented without human authorization or oversight. The Adeptus Mechanicus established specialized decontamination protocols for dealing with Imperial technology that had been exposed to Necron influence, but these procedures proved only partially effective. Tech priests conducting purification rituals reported that some machine spirits appeared to have been fundamentally altered by contact with alien systems, exhibiting responses to sacred algorithms that differed from established patterns. Attempts to restore these corrupted systems to original specifications often resulted in complete mechanical failure, forcing the replacement of equipment that had been contaminated beyond recovery. Agricultural systems on reclaimed worlds presented particular challenges due to the discovery that Necron biotransference technology had affected not only human populations, but also the biological foundations of food production. Soil analysis revealed the presence of exotic particles that enhanced crop yields while creating subtle changes in nutritional content that could not be detected through standard Imperial testing procedures. Livestock populations showed genetic modifications that improved their resistance to disease and environmental stress, but incorporated biological principles that violated Imperial understanding of natural selection and evolutionary development. The long-term implications of consuming food products that had been influenced by Necron biotechnology remained unclear, creating additional complications for feeding the sector's surviving population. Medical analysis of personnel who had consumed contaminated food products detected no immediate health effects, but the alien nature of the modifications made it impossible to predict long-term consequences. Imperial authorities faced the choice between accepting potentially dangerous food supplies or allowing starvation among populations that had already suffered catastrophic losses during the war. Trade relationships between the Orpheus Sector and neighboring Imperial territories required complete restructuring due to concerns about technological contamination spreading beyond the immediate war zone. Merchant vessels departing from sector worlds underwent extensive inspection procedures designed to detect the presence of alien technology or contaminated Imperial equipment. These security measures created significant delays in commercial operations while failing to provide complete assurance that Necron influence could be contained within the affected region. The sector's strategic importance to broader Imperial military operations remained unchanged despite the devastation caused by the war, creating pressure to restore full operational capacity regardless of contamination risks. Imperial Navy facilities required the specialized components produced by the sector's Forge worlds to maintain fleet readiness across 3 segmentums, while the agricultural output from surviving worlds remained essential for feeding populations throughout the region. Military necessity forced Imperial authorities to accept calculated risks regarding technological contamination in order to maintain strategic capabilities that were considered essential for the Imperium's broader security. Industrial capacity reconstruction proceeded according to protocols that prioritized military production over civilian needs, with Forge World facilities dedicated to producing anti-Xenos weapons and specialized monitoring equipment rather than consumer goods or civilian infrastructure components. This approach reflected the recognition that the Necron threat remained active despite Imperial military victories, requiring constant vigilance and preparation for renewed enemy activity. Manufacturing priorities focused on developing new technologies for detecting and countering alien influence rather than restoring pre-war production levels. The establishment of quarantine zones around areas of suspected ongoing Necron activity created additional complications for reconstruction efforts by limiting access to resources and infrastructure that had survived the war intact. These restricted areas included not only confirmed tomb sites, but also regions where monitoring equipment detected anomalous activity that could indicate hidden alien installations. The resulting patchwork of accessible and forbidden territories made comprehensive planning extremely difficult while creating logistical challenges that affected every aspect of reconstruction operations. Medical facilities throughout the sector required complete restructuring to address injury patterns and health effects that had no precedent in Imperial medical doctrine. The establishment of specialized treatment centers for personnel suffering from exposure to Necron technology required the development of new therapeutic techniques and the training of medical personnel in procedures that incorporated principles derived from xenotech analysis. These facilities operated under strict containment protocols to prevent the spread of technological contamination while providing care for conditions that defied conventional understanding of biology and medicine. The psychological rehabilitation of military personnel who had survived extended combat against Necron forces presented challenges that exceeded the capacity of standard Imperial mental health services. Traditional approaches to treating combat stress proved inadequate for addressing trauma caused by exposure to technologies that violated fundamental assumptions about reality and causality. Specialized counseling programs required the development of new therapeutic techniques that could help personnel process experiences that challenged their basic understanding of the physical universe. The ongoing threat of Necron reawakening created a state of permanent military readiness that affected every aspect of civilian life in the reconstructed sector. Emergency response protocols required all Imperial personnel to undergo training in recognizing signs of tomb complex activation while maintaining supplies of specialized equipment for dealing with alien technology. These preparations created a constant atmosphere of tension and vigilance that affected productivity and morale while consuming resources that could have been dedicated to reconstruction efforts. Defense spending throughout the sector increased dramatically as Imperial authorities recognized that conventional military forces had proven inadequate for dealing with the Necron threat. The development and deployment of specialized anti-Xenos weapons required ongoing investment in research and manufacturing capabilities that competed with civilian reconstruction needs for limited resources. Military installations designed to provide early warning and rapid response to renewed Necron activity required permanent staffing and maintenance that placed additional strain on the sector's reduced population. The integration of captured Necron technology into Imperial defensive systems created ethical and practical challenges that remained unresolved as reconstruction efforts continued. While alien devices provided capabilities that were essential for detecting and countering the ongoing threat, their use required Imperial personnel to operate equipment that functioned according to principles that contradicted fundamental Imperial doctrine. The resulting compromise between practical necessity and ideological purity created tensions within Imperial command structures that affected coordination and decision-making processes. The conclusion of active hostilities in the Orpheus Sector marked not an end, but a fundamental transformation in how the Imperium approached warfare against awakening Necron dynasties. The lessons carved in blood and ceramite across dozens of worlds became the foundation for new doctrinal frameworks that would influence Imperial military thinking for millennia to come. The Adeptus Munitorum's analysis of engagement records from the campaign revealed tactical patterns and technological countermeasures that were immediately disseminated to training facilities across the galaxy, while the Adeptus Mechanicus began incorporating anti-Xenos warfare principles into their standard equipment specifications. The establishment of specialized training protocols for anti-Necron operations began at the Schola Progenium facilities on Ophelia 7, where promising cadets underwent intensive instruction in recognizing Xenos technology signatures and coordinating electromagnetic pulse attacks with conventional weapons. These programs expanded rapidly to include Astra Militarum training centers throughout the Segmentum Solar, with veteran officers from the Orphean War serving as instructors who could provide first-hand knowledge of Necron capabilities and weaknesses. The curriculum incorporated detailed analysis of tomb complex layouts, biotransference facility recognition, and the psychological preparation necessary for fighting enemies that converted captured personnel into mechanical abominations. Imperial Guard regiments across the galaxy began receiving specialized equipment packages developed through analysis of Orphean War combat data. Electromagnetic pulse generators became standard issue for heavy weapons squads operating in sectors where Necron activity had been detected, while plasma weapons received priority distribution to units assigned to anti-Xenos operations. The Munitorum's logistics networks adapted to support the increased demand for exotic ammunition types, establishing production quotas for Kraken penetrator rounds and specialized electromagnetic pulse shells at Forge worlds throughout Imperial space. The integration of Space Marine tactical expertise into broader Imperial doctrine required significant modifications to existing command structures and operational procedures. Chapters that had participated in the Orphean War provided detailed after-action reports that were compiled into comprehensive tactical manuals distributed to Imperial Guard command staff. These documents outlined combined arms approaches that maximized the effectiveness of baseline human forces when operating alongside Adeptus Astartes units, emphasizing the importance of coordinated timing and specialized equipment deployment in achieving victory against technologically superior enemies. The Codex Astartes received its first major revision in over a millennium to incorporate lessons learned from extended anti-Necron operations. New tactical formations were established specifically for engaging enemies capable of teleportation and phase technology, while existing assault doctrines were modified to emphasize complete destruction of enemy units rather than the suppression and demoralization tactics that proved ineffective against mechanical opponents. These changes reflected a fundamental shift in Space Marine tactical thinking from the heroic individual combat that had characterized much of their previous doctrine towards systematic approaches that prioritized technological countermeasures and coordinated firepower. The transformation of the Orpheus Sector into a heavily militarized zone proceeded according to strategic plans that acknowledged the permanent nature of the Necron threat. Each world that had experienced Tomb Complex activation received a permanent garrison force equipped with specialized monitoring equipment and anti-Xenos weapons. These installations operated under direct Astra Militarum command rather than local planetary defense forces, reflecting the recognition that conventional Imperial troops lacked the training and equipment necessary to respond effectively to renewed Necron activity. Fortress complexes constructed around confirmed tomb sites incorporated architectural principles derived from analysis of Necron defensive positions encountered during the war. These installations featured overlapping fields of fire designed to counter teleportation attacks, while their power systems included electromagnetic pulse generators capable of creating sector-wide interference patterns. The fortress's underground levels extended deep enough to intercept potential Necron tunnel networks, with seismic monitoring arrays providing early warning of subterranean construction activity. The stockpiling of specialized anti-Necron equipment throughout the sector required the establishment of secure storage facilities designed to maintain exotic weapons and ammunition in combat-ready condition. These armories contained gravitational manipulation devices, quantum disruption field generators, and experimental weapon systems that incorporated principles derived from captured alien technology. The facilities operated under strict security protocols that limited access to personnel with specialized training in handling equipment that functioned according to non-human engineering principles. Imperial Navy assets assigned to the Orpheus Sector received permanent upgrades that reflected lessons learned from void engagements with Necron tomb ships. Fleet vessels carried specialized sensor arrays capable of detecting the quantum signatures associated with alien stealth systems, while their weapon loadouts emphasized sustained fire capabilities that could overwhelm Necron self-repair mechanisms. Escort squadrons maintained constant patrol schedules designed to intercept tomb ships before they could reach planetary targets, operating according to engagement protocols that prioritized early detection over direct confrontation. The Adeptus Mechanicus established permanent research facilities throughout the sector dedicated to ongoing analysis of Necron technology and the development of improved countermeasures. These installations operated under the highest levels of security classification, with access restricted to tech adepts who had undergone extensive screening for resistance to technological corruption. The research programs focused on understanding the fundamental principles underlying alien engineering approaches while developing Imperial technologies that could match or exceed Necron capabilities without violating core Imperial doctrine. Archaeological restrictions implemented across the Imperium following the Orphean War reflected a fundamental shift in how Imperial authorities approached pre-human ruins and artifacts. The Adeptus Terra issued sector-wide mandates requiring immediate reporting of any archaeological discoveries that exhibited characteristics similar to those found in the Orpheus Sector, while excavation activities on worlds with suspected ancient civilizations required approval from the highest levels of Imperial command. These measures acknowledged that the galaxy contained numerous dormant threats that could be inadvertently activated through careless exploration. Forge worlds throughout Imperial space received detailed technical specifications for identifying potentially dangerous xenotech artifacts, along with protocols for containing and studying such materials without triggering activation sequences. The Adeptus Mechanicus developed specialized containment systems that could isolate alien devices within null field generators while preventing the quantum entanglement effects that had contributed to the Orphean War's escalation. These facilities required constant monitoring by tech adepts trained in recognizing the subtle signs of alien technology, attempting to establish communication with distant installations. The Ordo Xenos expanded its operations significantly in response to intelligence gathered during the Orphean War regarding the extent of dormant Necron installations throughout the galaxy. Inquisitors received updated threat assessment protocols that incorporated recognition patterns for identifying worlds likely to contain tomb complexes, while their investigation teams gained access to specialized equipment developed through analysis of captured alien technology. The Order's research facilities began compiling comprehensive databases of Necron Dynasty territorial claims and awakening patterns to predict where future threats might emerge. Planetary governors across Imperial space found themselves subject to new reporting requirements that mandated immediate notification of unusual seismic activity, unexplained technological discoveries, or population disappearances that might indicate Necron activity. These protocols created additional bureaucratic burdens for colonial administrators while providing early warning systems that could prevent isolated incidents from escalating into sector-wide conflicts. The Administratum established rapid response teams capable of deploying anti-Xenos specialists to investigate potential threats before they could develop into major military operations. The Orphean War's influence on subsequent campaigns against awakening Necron dynasties became apparent within decades of the conflict's conclusion. Imperial forces engaging the Sodek dynasty during the Damnos incident applied tactical doctrines developed in the Orpheus Sector, using electromagnetic pulse weapons and coordinated artillery strikes to achieve victory against enemies that had previously proven invulnerable to conventional Imperial tactics. The success of these operations validated the strategic investments made in anti-Xenos warfare capabilities, while demonstrating the broader applicability of lessons learned through bitter experience. Military academies throughout the Imperium incorporated detailed case studies of Orphean War battles into their strategic curriculum, with particular emphasis on the importance of technological adaptation and combined arms coordination when facing superior enemies. Officer candidates studied the tactical innovations developed by Lord Commander Hack and his subordinates, learning to recognize the patterns of technological escalation that characterized extended campaigns against Necron forces. These educational programs emphasized the psychological challenges of fighting enemies that violated fundamental assumptions about warfare while providing practical training in maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress. The establishment of the Orphean War Memorial on Terra created a permanent reminder of the campaign's cost, while serving as a center for ongoing research into anti-Xenos warfare. The memorial complex included archives containing detailed records of every engagement fought during the conflict, along with technical specifications for the specialized equipment developed through analysis of captured Necron technology. These resources remained available to Imperial military planners developing strategies for future campaigns against awakening tomb worlds. The war's place in Imperial military history was secured through its inclusion in the official chronicles maintained by the Adeptus Munitorum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Historical analyses emphasize the campaign's significance as the first major Imperial victory against a fully awakened Necron dynasty, while technical reports documented the technological innovations that had made such success possible. These records served as foundational documents for Imperial strategic planning regarding the ongoing threat posed by dormant Xeno civilizations throughout the galaxy. The transformation of Imperial military doctrine extended beyond tactical modifications to encompass fundamental changes in how the Imperium approached the exploration and colonization of new worlds. Archaeological surveys became mandatory components of colonial planning processes, with specialized teams trained to recognize signs of ancient civilizations before full-scale settlement operations began. These precautions reflected hard-won understanding that the galaxy's history contained numerous threats that could be awakened through careless expansion. The long-term strategic implications of the Orphean War continued to influence Imperial policy decades after the conflict's conclusion. The recognition that humanity shared the galaxy with dormant civilizations possessing superior technology created new priorities for Imperial research and development programs, while the demonstrated effectiveness of coordinated anti-Xenos tactics influenced military organization and training throughout Imperial space. The war had proven that technological superiority could be overcome through proper preparation and tactical innovation, but only at enormous cost in human lives and resources. The Orpheus Sector itself remained a testament to both Imperial resilience and the permanent nature of certain threats. Monitoring stations continued their vigilant watch over confirmed tomb sites, while garrison forces maintained readiness for renewed Necron activity that intelligence analyses suggested was inevitable rather than merely possible. The sector's transformation from a prosperous collection of industrial and agricultural worlds into a heavily fortified frontier zone served as a reminder that the Imperium's expansion had awakened ancient enemies whose full capabilities remained unknown. The ongoing research into Necron technology conducted in the sector's specialized facilities continued producing innovations that enhanced Imperial military capabilities while raising disturbing questions about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Each breakthrough in understanding alien engineering principles revealed new possibilities for Imperial technological development, while demonstrating the vast gulf that separated human understanding from the achievements of civilizations that had ruled the galaxy millions of years before humanity's first steps into space. The legacy of the Orphean War thus encompassed both tactical innovations that would save countless Imperial lives in future conflicts and sobering recognition of the Imperium's place in a galaxy where humanity represented merely the most recent claimant to worlds that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations beyond human comprehension. The victory achieved through such tremendous sacrifice served as both inspiration for future campaigns and warning of the costs that would be required to secure humanity's survival in a universe where ancient gods slumbered beneath the foundations of human civilization, waiting for the moment when they would reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs.